Also think we can start. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening from Paris to wherever you're connecting from. I'd like to welcome you very warmly to this workshop on capacity development to support developing countries' access to climate finance. This is the first workshop in a series organized by the OECD and the UNFCCC Paris Committee on Capacity Building Network, and in collaboration with the Commonwealth. My name is Juan Casado Asensio. I'm an analyst at the OECD Development Cooperation Directorate. I'm working on environment, climate change, and development cooperation issues. And before we get started, and as we wait for additional colleagues to join the workshop, we would like to go over a few netiquette points with you, just to make sure that everything goes and runs smoothly. Let me see if we can pull up the slide. Yes, so please make sure that your microphones are muted, except of course when you're meant to speak. Please use the chat window for comments, for questions, to share resources that you think may be useful for other colleagues. If possible, if you could take a minute to rename provide us with your full name and organization indicated, so that we can, identify you, and also whenever you use the raise the hand function to intervene, be able to call on your name and organization. Please turn on your cameras if possible, and then mute whenever you want to take the floor and make an intervention, and make sure, if possible, to keep those interventions short to allow maximum speakers to share their views. Should you have any technical issues, please contact us or the UNFCCC colleagues. We will be putting in the chat now those emails that you see there. So if you run into any sort of technical issue, please let us know. And finally, there will be a post-event survey. So please reply that when we send it to you, so that you can tell us what your thoughts were on this first workshop, so that we can improve and cater these type of events closer to your needs and expectations. Okay, with those housekeeping rules behind us, and sorry for such comprehensive list, let me now pass the floor to Mr. Jens Sedemul, who is our team lead and head of unit of the DAC Environment and Development Cooperation, the Environment Secretariat, for some welcoming remarks. Jens, please.
Thank you very much, Juan, and a warm welcome also from my side to all participants. Let me start by thanking our colleagues in the UNFCCC Secretariat for the partnership on this event and on further work on capacity development, but also thank the Commonwealth Secretariat for collaborating and delivering this workshop. We really look forward to working with both of you beyond this workshop on this issue. Now, coming to the topic of this workshop, capacity development. And I think what I would like to start out with is to say that it's really at the core of donor and development activities, and has been for many years as a key enabler for sustainable development. And this is also the case for supporting climate change and climate action on climate change. And I think I would add that actually, if you look at capacity constraints, they are a fundamental dimension of the development challenge overall. And at a very basic level, what differentiates the ability to act on development, on climate action. So what differentiates the ability to act between high-income countries, low-income countries, relates in essence to their ability to deploy capacities and to mobilize or access resources. And I think the two are also closely interlinked. So it's really a central climate action challenge, and at the same time a defining development challenge. Now, that importance is also reflected if you look at development cooperation resources and where they go to. Donors from the Development Assistance Committee at the OECD invested up to 44% of their climate-related official development assistance in capacity development activities. There are many examples of good practices and successes in capacity development, but the literature and evaluation also points in a different direction, and I think that goes to demonstrate the fact that it's really a fundamental challenge and a fundamental question or bottleneck to achieving development, whereby many of the investments that are being made are not really contributing to developing the capacity of developing countries in a sustainable and effective manner. So again, I think capacity develop in the context of the topic of climate action has been found very much to be a key ingredient to actually help countries access finance that, if designed well, can really accelerate climate action ambition. And I think contrary to the sort of findings in lots of the research and literature, what we really want to focus on here and what this workshop is aiming to do is looking where actually there's experience on solutions, on good practices, on ideas of what works and why, versus spending all our time or focus on the bottlenecks and barriers, again, of which there are clearly very significant ones. But the hope is really to inspire, for this to allow more effective and sort of a bit of pickup across the international development community of what works well. And to this end, we are very pleased that the agenda for today brings together multiple voices, which will focus on both the bottlenecks and messages for the donor community. And we're also looking forward to splitting up halfway through the session, more or less, into 3 breakout groups. One on effective solutions, a second one with a particular focus on small island developing states, and the third one on the private sector, followed then by a plenary discussion. And again, also, we understand very much that the question of capacity is relevant and relates to a diverse set of stakeholders. So we're very happy that over the course of the workshop, we will hear voices from a very diverse background, from academia, think tanks, developing countries, donors, international organizations and funds, and from sort of, more young and more senior colleagues alike. So with that, I don't want to keep you further. I really look forward to an open exchange and discussion, including very much from participants that are not listed as speakers on the agenda, in the breakout groups, in the plenary, and via the chat. Please share your questions, interact with the speakers, and post any good practice examples that you can think of, so that we can all use them. And thank you again for joining this workshop, for your engagement, and I'm very pleased to now pass over to Roberta Janna, the co-chair of the Paris Committee on Capacity Building. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone joining today. My name is Roberta Janna, and I'm the co-chair of the Paris Committee on Capacity Building, as was just said, the so-called PCCB. And on behalf of the entire committee, I would like to welcome you all to this first session kicking off the OECD PCCB Network Workshop Series on capacity development for climate action and ambition. For those who don't know that well, the PCCB, it was established at COP21 in 2015, and it addresses current and emerging gaps and needs in implementing and further enhancing capacity building in developing countries. The mission of the PCCB is to identify capacity gaps and needs and potential solutions, including enhancing the coherence and coordination of capacity building efforts related to climate change. To support the PCCB's mission, the committee therefore set up the PCCB Network in 2020 as a voluntary association of interested stakeholders engaged in climate-related capacity building, who can share information and good practices of their work, contribute to the work of the PCCB in fulfilling its mandate, and seek to connect with their peers across sectors and regions. Currently, we have over 280 members across 80 different countries, and there is always room for more. OECD has recently joined the network, and on behalf of the PCCB, I'd like to extend a really warm welcome to the organization. That being said, the PCCB network is a dynamic and member-driven network, and here we are already at the first workshop led by the OECD and supported by the Commonwealth Secretariat. Right capacity in the right place and with the right stakeholder can really speed up climate action and drive up ambition and foster low carbon, climate resilient development. And as stakeholders in the capacity building landscape, we are very excited to witness and contribute to the fruitful outcome of the network. And so having said that, I wish you all a great session.
Thank you very much, Roberta, and also thanks to Jens. And I would like now to move quickly to the next session and give the floor now to Alejandro Kilpatrick. Alejandro Kilpatrick is the manager of the Capacity Building Subdivision of the UNFCCC Secretariat, and he will be conducting you through the first, through session 2 and the main panel of this workshop, which will be focusing on lifting the bottlenecks to access finance in partner countries and through capacity development. Alejandro, what is yours?
Thank you very much, Juan. Hello, good morning, good evening, good afternoon. I have the pleasure of moderating this panel, and I want to thank the OECD and the Commonwealth.
Alejandro, if I may, 1 second, we cannot hear you very well.
Can you hear me better now?
Can you speak?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yeah, very, very softly.
Let me see if I increase my, can you hear me a bit better? Hello?
Seems like to be okay now, thank you.
Okay, so thank you again, Juan. And I was saying I have the privilege of moderating this panel. We have very excellent panelists, but maybe just, and as mentioned by Jens, we're not only looking at bottlenecks for its sake of understanding bottlenecks, but how also, more importantly, how to lift them. And that's the title of this panel, Lifting Bottlenecks to Access Climate Finance in Partner Countries to Capacity Development. Just a bit of background, we all know that donors have dedicated programs to create enabling environments to help partner countries apply for funding, for example. There are a lot of initiatives on direct access, notably for local institutions. Another way to support partner countries is through streamlining processes for accessing funding, for example, for small and developing states. Other methods and instruments include technical assistance, policy support, and other training activities. However, evaluations of projects and programs have shown that these often need to have more flexibility and be more forward-looking and more impactful. So this panel discussion will look mainly at the following issues, and we'll be hearing from our panelists on these 3 issues. What are the main capacity bottlenecks that partner countries face today to access and mobilize climate finance? How can donors better support partner countries in their efforts to access finance? And what is the role of capacity development here? Then, as Jens mentioned, what are the positive experiences or lessons learned where donors could draw inspiration and that could be scaled up or replicated? So just as a means of an introduction, now let me introduce our distinguished panel. So we have Mrs. Amanda McKee from the Ndc Partnership. She's the Knowledge and Learning Director and Interim Country Engagement Director from the Ndc Partnership. Welcome, Amanda. I know it's very early for you, so we really appreciate you making the time for this workshop. We also have Ndc Partnership, who's the Deputy Director in charge of Climate Vulnerability and Adaptation at the Climate Change Department of the Ghana's EPA, Environmental Protection Agency. We also have Karen McNamara, an ARC Future Fellow, Associate Professor, Faculty of Science, University of Queensland, Brisbane in Australia. Nadesh Trosalia, who's with the Climate Technology Center and Network as a climate change specialist for Africa, CIS, and West Africa. And also, we're very pleased to have Ms. Lavanya Jenna, who's from the Commonwealth Secretariat. She's a regional climate advisor for the Indo-Pacific region. So welcome to our panelists. So I will ask them to join virtually, maybe to turn your cameras on so that we can have a feeling of a panel discussion. So we have two rounds of questions for our panelists. So I'll ask the first question, and I'll kindly ask our panelists to provide their feedback in around 2.5 minutes maximum, because we have 2 questions and it would be important for effective time management. So let me then kick off with a question specifically for Amanda for the Ndc Partnership. In your experience in the Ndc Partnership, can you provide us a bit of an overview of what are the capacity development needs you've heard from countries particularly, and what are the bottlenecks when it comes to accessing finance? So over to you, Amanda. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Alejandro, and thank you to the UNFCCC, the PCCB, the OECD for inviting me to join today's panel. So just to start, for those of you who don't know the Ndc Partnership, we're an international coalition for climate action, and we were created 5 years ago under the simple yet powerful premise that together we can achieve more. So through the partnership, we bring together more than 200 members, and this includes 115 countries, both developed and developing, and then more than 80 institutions. And our mission is really to help countries in their efforts to plan and implement their climate commitments, and to help bring together international partners around this country-led process to do so. And we're currently supporting close to 80 of our developing countries in this regard. In the past couple years, we've been focused a lot on supporting countries in their NDC update. Specifically, we supported 67 countries to enhance their NDCs, which led countries to not only raise their ambition, but also put forward NDCs that were higher quality and, importantly, more implementable and more realistic. And what we're seeing now is that as countries move to implement these ambitious climate commitments, more resources and more support to access these resources is going to be needed. And I think the important point that we really try to push is that countries have really raised the bar during the last NDC revision cycle. And I'm referring to smaller developing countries who haven't made a big input in climate change. But now we need their commitments to be met with equally ambitious support from on implementation and widespread resource mobilization. So it's not surprising then that finance is actually one of the most requested topics for support that we receive through the partnership. Nearly every country that's requested support through the partnership has one request related to finance. And these range from support for creating enabling environments all the way to developing bankable projects. So I wanted to just start off this intervention by laying out some of the bottlenecks that we've seen countries experience. And really meeting the finance needs of countries is going to involve more than just committing more money. There are demand side challenges, there are supply side challenges, and there's a gap between the two that needs to be closed, and capacity building is critical to all of those. So on the demand side, we see a lack of capacity and knowledge to articulate the demand for climate finance in terms of the development of quality project pipelines, investment strategies, and plans to implement the NDC. So clearly laying out the needs in a way that's going to be accessible to the different international players. On the supply side, we see a lack of capacity in many countries to map the potential climate finance that's out there that they can tap into, and to engage the private sector and investors to mobilize finance for climate action. And at the same time, we also see a lack of capacity on the private sector side, in that they're not always familiar with NDCs and the climate context in countries. And they're mainly looking for large-scale investments with minimal risks. And so the last bottleneck I wanted to share is really about closing the gap. And closing the gap in countries, we see the challenge of navigating international public finance landscape, really complying with the different and very time-consuming processes that exist, and the requirements that this imposes on countries to be able to access those funds. The other big challenge is a lack of enabling environments within countries, which is preventing the catalyzation of private sector. So I know I've laid out a large kind of laundry list of challenges, but I wanted to just start with that overall framing, and over to you, Alejandro.
Thank you very much, Amanda. Sorry, I had some issues unmuting myself. So if you cannot hear me well, please do let me know. I think thank you for outlining those bottlenecks. I think it's a good starting point for the rest of this panel discussion. But now then I will want to go to Anwi and maybe to hear a bit from you, what's the experience from Ghana in accessing climate finance, and what's the importance of capacity development or the capacity constraints you had in your experience. So Anwi, over to you.
Thank you so much, Alejandro, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to colleagues. Such a great experience to be here. This in Ghana is still morning, so this morning. I think it's a good chance to actually share once again with OECD, because I have the opportunity in the past to do some kind of interventions on Ghana's experience when it comes to climate financing. A developing nation within the West African country takes climate action seriously from the onset, ever since Ghana joined the UNFCCC process. And we've had the opportunity to actually tried a number of means to mainstream climate actions in our activities. Since focusing on climate financing and capacity in country, I think we have had a mixed experience, some positive strides as a country, and then some kind of challenges, as maybe I'll finish by highlighting the challenges. But let me start off by saying that as a country, we've had some kind of positive strides in assessing climate financing for different activities, for adaptation interventions, for mitigation interventions, and then also for transparency related activities like the reporting frameworks, reporting on the BULs, national communications, and then also some other mandated reporting activities under the process. In terms of capacity internally, at the national level, we've taken pain in the past to actually strengthen institutional capacity to work together as institutions. So because of the cross-sectoral nature of climate action, you need capacities not only from the finance ministry, but you need from the environment, you need from forestry, you need from agriculture, you need from water, and so on and so forth. And so by setting up working groups in the past as part of our reporting processes, has kind of built some internal capacities for various sectors in assessing climate financing. The example I can cite is the fact that a number of sectors have submitted quite a number of proposals to the Green Climate Fund, for instance, to assess funding. The approval lies on the fund to actually give but the point is that the sectors are making strides to be able to assess funding through various funding proposals. There might be some other areas where we have also been able to get some readiness financing to address some of these internal climate actions. In the past, even before the Green Climate Fund came into being, we had some kind of good experiences bilaterally with some donor communities from the EU, from Japan, from the German cooperation, and so many other from the World Bank multilaterally, and some other interventions that have been supporting internal climate action. However, this is not the case when it goes to the subnational level, where climate action actually is needed most, because the vulnerabilities that we speak about actually hit the communities at the subnational level. This is not the case because it is very difficult, as I speak to now, to actually pinpoint one single project that has been facilitated at a subnational level to assessing climate financing in this scheme. And so much as we try to build capacity at the national level, I think the subnational level has a different story actually to tell. And so that's an area that has to be. In terms of I just want to wrap up quickly because I don't have much time. In terms of our experiences in assessing some of these finances, I think one of the key challenges has been the complexities or the complicated nature of some of these support, especially when you want to go through the Green Climate Finance Access, you want to go through the JEF process, the Adaptation Fund, some similarities in terms of complications. which probably the previous speaker actually started by alluding to some of them. Probably we can take these issues in deeper discussions when we have other engagement. But for our experience as a country has been positives and then also some negatives to talk about in the first place. So thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to make this intervention.
No, thank you very much, Anwi, and thank you for highlighting the positives and maybe not so positives. I think that you mentioned two important aspects in my view, the fact of this coordination and that capacities are not only in the focal point ministry, that you have to also look at ministries of finance and other ministries of planning, etc. You also mentioned the complex requirements of the funds, and I think we'll continue hearing a bit about that. But you also mentioned the importance of national, sub-national level capacities for accessing finance, and I think that's a nice segue for our next panelist, Karen McNamara. So the question for you is, how can we optimize actions on climate change for local communities in Pacific states, in this case, accessing finance, which is the focus. So Karen, over to you.
Thank you. It is a segue. It's a slight deviation of, it's more, what I'm going to talk about is more about not how to access finance, but what happens when once that finance hits local communities, because I think it's important to reflect on some lessons and learnings about what happens when that finance hits, so it can kind of be put back up through the pipeline to how we design projects to begin with, and designing projects for financing. So thanks so much for having me. I'm calling in from Brisbane in Australia, which is Yagara and Turrbal lands. And so I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. It is the evening here in Brisbane, so I have some notes scribbled down because my brain stops working at about 5 o'clock, so bear with me. But as we know, adaptation funding is increasingly being redirected to bottom-up approaches, so like community-based adaptation or CBA, but our understanding of what really leads to success and failure and what best practice CBA looks like is still in its infancy. So I'm going to run through some key recommendations that we've uncovered over the last few years from a large 3-year study that we did across the Pacific, across 4 countries in the region, 20 communities. We evaluated 32 very diverse community-based adaptation initiatives from a whole range of different funding and implementing agencies. So some of the big donors, universities, NGOs, government ministries. We engaged 415 participants, but this is really in-depth qualitative work. So very, very time consuming. The results that kind of came out of this were very, very mixed. The degree of success for those CBA initiatives was really mixed. Some projects performing quite well and a whole chunk in the middle, and then quite a few at the end that really weren't. Initiative appropriateness was a strength, but sustainability was a constant issue. Those that were locally funded and implemented by local NGOs in particular seemed to perform better. And often the best performing initiatives were those that had really raised climate change awareness. So there was a real education training component in them, and those that integrated with ecosystem-based adaptation. But from that, we extracted these 4 optimization points. So I'm just going to quickly run through those 4 points. The first one probably is no surprise, but it was about, and it's so important to still emphasize this, but it was about local approval and ownership. We know that can foster higher levels of participation, but increase the likelihood of initiatives being sustained in the longer term. I've got lots of examples of where that worked well and where it didn't work well, but I might just send resources across to Juan and the team, and please, anybody reach out to me over email. I'm really happy to pass those on as well. But with this optimization point, what we were finding is that external actors were too often designing the initiatives, coming into the community, consulting and seeking their approval and ownership, but still ultimately making the decisions about that initiative. And instead, we need to strive for CBA that's inherently designed and owned by those local communities. The second key optimization point was around getting that shared access and benefit from initiatives for everyone in that community. So when people are marginalized, or there's power dynamics at play in these local communities, or people are left behind, or there's internal disputes going on, then adaptation is just not effective or sustainable. We have some really powerful examples of where that really interrupted and disrupted the success of those initiatives. The third optimization point was around the integration of local realities. So initiatives must be shaped and driven by context, that's sociocultural, local context, the priorities of communities, the resources that they have access to, knowledge, Indigenous knowledge is critically important, but also worldviews. Doing so increases the likelihood of that ownership, so tapping into that first optimization point, but improved outcomes and activities being sustained in the long term. So we really do need adaptation that's wholly driven by communities because they know their local realities best, rather than external actors who often shape these initiatives based on these external worldviews and resources and knowledge sets. The fourth and final optimization point, and then I'll end, for improved success of CBA initiatives was around the need for systems thinking, but also forward planning. So systems thinking, there's some nice examples showing this, but thinking about all sources of vulnerability in those local contexts. So you consider all the different, beyond climate risk, what are the other sources of vulnerability that are impacting and shaping and affecting at play in that system? They all need to be considered. And forward planning in equal measure is also really important. So several initiatives overlooked future trends, even in relation to climate risk, but also in things like population, and that had an impact on longer term sustainability of those initiatives. Last little point to make is that, so in sum, adaptation needs to be wholly led by local people and local institutions, so they're able to build their strengths and drive their own agendas based on local knowledge, resources, experiences and coping mechanisms. And donors and implementers should really realign themselves as facilitators who can support and resource, which really speaks to Yen's point earlier on in the opening, to resource the diverse capacities of communities. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much, Karen. Thank you for sharing those optimizations. I think very, very important points there, particularly the issue of ownership and community drivenness. And I like the concept of alignment, donors being aligned to that. So thank you so much for that. Now we'll turn on to Lavanya and hear a bit from the Commonwealth. What's the Commonwealth? How is the Commonwealth addressing the capacity constraints in accessing climate finance in your membership? So Lavanya, over to you.
Thanks for inviting me in this forum. Yeah, through Commonwealth, we have a climate finance access hub. It's a hub and spoke model, basically. We are trying to unlock the available climate finance for various countries. We have around 12 climate finance advisors who are closely working with Ministry of Economy or Ministry of Finance in accessing climate finance, particularly from international communities. So there are three ways we support the countries. One is in human and institutional capacity development, where our technical advisors are there deployed in the country. So they are closely working with the government ministries and try to deliver human and institutional capacity in various ways. For example, there are discussions around accreditation support, which is essential for this country to directly get capital from GCF kind of institutions. We also help in developing policy and climate finance readiness. The second is technical support, which is essential, particularly for project by project. So for short-term advisory services, as you know that there is not enough capacity available in this country to design projects, which is essential to access climate finance. So that we provide technical support project by project basis. In addition to that, before the project development, we do a lot of work in project preparation, which is essential, because what happens that the private sector or the public sector in these countries, they don't have the capacity to design project, which is essential. Because what happens that the public sector, or both private sector and public sector, they are hugely unfunded. So what happens that many times in the ecosystem, the private sector is hesitant to do something which is going to help everybody in the ecosystem. So there is an inertia from public sector as well, because they have other priorities. So we help them in preparing and developing to the project where it can be bankable. At least financial proposal can be prepared where we can speak with donor communities or commercial capital provider or public finance provider to access capital. Second is that like we have our hub and spoke model, we operate in different countries. So we do something called knowledge management. Basically, we draw knowledge and lessons from other countries so that it can be shared. For example, we are currently doing a FREP kind of model in Fiji. Basically, in this model, we are trying to source different kinds of capital, basically brain-to capital, and try to meet the objectives of various beneficiaries. So particularly in this country, it's extremely difficult to provide, for example, electricity at a commercial rate, because it's not feasible in this country because of the low per capita income. So you need to identify beneficiaries who can pay and the beneficiaries who cannot pay. So accordingly, you design financial instrument or develop the financial mechanism to access climate finance. That's what we do in Climate Finance Access Hub. But let me tell you before some of the things which we should be very, very concerned about that. If we see the amount of capital this country needs, it's around $1 billion per annum. There is a gap of $1 billion. So if it's particularly Pacific economy, so Pacific Island countries, they need $1 billion of climate adaptation, which is around 20% of their GDP. So if we see the 20, not 10% of the GDP, the saving rate of this country is only 20%. So we cannot expect this country to invest 50% of the savings in climate adaptation. That's not possible for these countries. And some countries, it is only 25, it's also 25% of the GDP, which is not possible. But it's tricky for climate adaptation in this country because it is not commercially feasible. Climate mitigation, you can identify the beneficiaries. For example, electricity, electric transportation, you can identify the beneficiaries who can pay the money for the services. But in the climate adaptation, which is public good in nature, that's very, very critical. And they don't have enough resources to design climate adaptation projects, which will help them to access capital, which is essential. And secondly, as I said earlier, they don't have enough capital. In this case, so there is a huge need to draw capital from international donor communities as well as concessional capital provider like ADB, World Bank, or GCF kind of institutions. Concessional, sometimes I think it's not concessional, it's free capital which they need. Without that climate adaptation, which they need much more than climate mitigation, because their climate change contribution may be less than 0.01% in the world, but they are the highest, most vulnerable regions in the world. So we need to seriously consider that. So one is capacity building, second is providing concessional capital, even if grant capital, which is necessary. Another important critical thing is that we need to develop the private sector in these countries, because what happens that in this country, mostly they rely on public sector, which is not good enough because the public sector has several mandates. So we need to, for example, Fiji like a country who, I mean, if you see all the climate mitigation projects, the companies are vertically integrated in the sense that they are in the business of generations, their distribution, as well as transmission of electricity. And there are not enough private developers which need to be upgraded, which need to be developed, because in this country we need distributed energy. So it's essential. Private sector players, they are much more efficient than the public sector in the providing distributed electricity in these countries. So we need to develop private sector as well. And they need to find a way where they can access private capital, and they are hugely unfunded. So we need to think that how we can access private capital, not necessarily only public capital, even if private capital with support from public capital, which is essential for this private capital to fund this kind of activities. So I'll stop here. I think I will have a second chance to talk about that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Levania. You mentioned very important aspects, that it's not only capacity building is fundamental, capacity development, but also the provision of capital, and also the role of the private sector. And we'll have a dedicated working group later on the private sector. So I think that there's a lot of room for continuing discussing around that topic. So the last panelist for this first round is Nadesh from the CTCN. And Nadesh, could you please share with us some examples of effective capacity development to access climate finance based on CTCN experiences? Thank you. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone. Thank you very much for the invitation to this webinar. Thank you, the OECD. Thank you, the UNFCCC, and thank you, the PCCB. Just before starting, just for those who doesn't know the CTCN is the operational arm of the technology mechanism. It is hosted by UNEP. in collaboration with UNIDO, and we are supported by 11 partner institutions with expertise in climate technologies. So my intervention will firstly provide some practical examples of effective capacity development to access climate finance that the CTCN had the chance to support in the past years with developing countries as well as LDCs. And another time we will share good practices and maybe lessons learned from that we have identified to enhance the capacity of the countries in accessing climate finance. So to start with, I would like to share a couple of success stories of countries accessing climate finance. The first that comes to my mind is the technical assistance that we called Vision to Concept. And this capacity building program has proven useful in supporting countries to secure potential funding for project ideas related to the implementation of the TNA or Technology Action Plan. The main objective of the program was to fast-track the implementation of countries' NDCs by building capacities of key stakeholders in developing bankable project proposals to access climate finance from the Green Climate Fund mainly. Stakeholders were equipped with an improved understanding of the process of transforming priorities outlined in the country's climate change process. It can be NDC, TNA, Green Climate Fund country program, or else, and to concrete project ideas through an 8-day training program and a post-training mentoring for up to 3 months. The capacity building module culminates in a set of well-articulated concept notes draft, 4 for Eswatini as well as 4 for Sudan, including a roadmap towards the submission. From the 8 concept notes that were developed, 3 were picked by Green Climate Fund accredited entities for further development and to Green Climate Fund proposals and submissions for funding. So just to very quickly give an overview of the type of concept notes that were designed for Eswatini, there were one on urban resilience, another one in sustainable energy, another one about integrated natural resources management, and the last one on low carbon waste management. And for Sudan, we were talking about solar power plant, sustainable forest management, watershed management. So then I think I would like to mention maybe the Adaptation Fund as well, some success stories that we have with the Adaptation Fund. Concept notes have proven to be a successful way to access and to leverage climate finance. And to provide an example, the CTCN has recently been requested by Seychelles to support them in formulating a pre-concept proposal to the innovation facility of the Adaptation Fund for a holistic watershed management approach, including wetland creation for water supply, forest fire fighting, and hydropower generation, forest rehabilitation for ecosystem services, and ecotourism enhancement in 2 different sites in Seychelles. So we are working with Seychelles in formulating this pre-concept proposal, hoping that it will be approved by the Adaptation Fund and we could move to the full-scale proposal. To continue with example, it would be difficult not to mention the Green Climate Fund. It is the world's largest climate fund. And the CTCN is the largest delivery partner of the Green Climate Fund for readiness on technologies, with 30 readiness approved by the Green Climate Fund, over 56 in total for the last of 2021. So this readiness cover a very large range of sectors and can be as well multi-sectors proposals. So as it is the case for technology needs assessment, for example, for which we have already 15 projects under implementation and through the request of the countries, but they can also be very specific. And I would like to just very shortly, very briefly highlight the case of Tunisia that recently approved a readiness proposal with the Green Climate Fund on the development of strategic framework for upgradation to a smart water network system through technological interventions in 2 locations in Tunisia. And finally, and I will close my intervention practical example with this project, country can also access funding through the GEF. And to describe this mechanism, I would like to present a recent proposal that was approved with UNIDO CTCN as delivery partner. And the objective of this proposal is to pilot innovative finance for climate change adaptation in small and medium-sized cities in 3 different continents, so Africa, Latin America, and Asia. This project will be implemented in Mozambique, in the very small city of Chokwe, in Lao, in the city of Quezon, as well as in Antigua in Barbuda, in the city of English Harbour. So we are currently discussing where and when the official launch will be, but it's something that has been recently approved, and we are very proud to be starting this challenging project in three countries, 3 cities, LDCs and seeds. And then come the questions on how could country enhance the capacity to access climate finance. And for those who participate in the previous webinar organized by CCCB Toolkit, by the CCCB for the PCCB Toolkit, they will probably think that I'm repeating myself, but even though I was thinking about the question, I could not say that again, that we believe that to effectively assess capacity to access climate finance, it is important not to be too impatient. That capacity building, it's a long time process. That capacity building needs to be institutionalized. It needs to be implemented for years, and it needs to be scaled so that the capacity is always maintained in the country, even though there is turnover in the different ministries. So it's very something that we need to be patient. It won't come from a day or another. And as already mentioned by the other speakers, it's very important that it is grassroots. So that the adaptation is really dependent of the communities, really dependent of the needs, and it cannot be that easily replicated, but it needs to be very based on the identified needs. So it seems primordial that the country benefit from the right kind of enabling environment and market. And this enabling environment maybe needs to be created before we can access climate finance. Maybe one idea that I would be very happy to discuss and to exchange with the others would be that to leverage climate finance, countries could enter into partnership. This partnership could be north to south, maybe just only south-south, so that capacity could be improved. That would be more or less the message I wanted to pass. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Now that's very important messages about partnerships, collaboration, the importance of building institutional capacity, and congratulations on the great work being done by the CTC and together with the Green Climate Fund for helping countries access finance. And colleagues, we finished the first round of questions. Now let's go into the second round. We heard a lot on both bottlenecks and what the different institutions are doing. So we're running a bit behind time. So maybe for the next question, it will be more focused on your suggestions, ideas on how to lift the bottlenecks. So let's start again in the same order with Amanda. So Amanda, based on your experience, what do you think, or how do you think donors could harness the work being done on their NDCs to deliver capacity development for accessing finance? So based on your Ndc partnership experience, Amanda, over to you.
Thanks, Alejandro. So we've been thinking about this a lot, and actually last month, the Ndc Partnership launched its finance strategy to really clearly articulate some of the ways that members can support the mobilization and access to finance. And through the strategy, we outlined several service offerings, and I won't go through all of them, but I want to just highlight a couple of them that touch specifically on capacity development. And actually, the finance strategy includes, it's the first service offering, an explicit offering on strengthening capacity development. What we see is country requests in this area really center around enhancing both individual and institutional capacity. And the types of requests that we're seeing countries come with are hiring specialists in climate subject matter and climate related projects, as well as conducting trainings to enhance technical capacity and ensure that the delivery of NDC and climate commitments can take place across the government. A significant part of our capacity development work has focused on this, on deploying embedded advisors to governments. And these add both capacity in the near term and provide the expertise that can strengthen institutional knowledge in the longer term. So building up domestic capacity rather than relying on fly-in, fly-out consultants. And this is really imperative to sustaining the impact and ensuring the work that's done is really reflected in the local context as well. So through the partnership, we've embedded close to 100 in-country advisors to support whole of society, whole of government approaches, both for the NDC update as well as implementation. This includes a number of advisors that were deployed in support of the NDC update, and Commonwealth was an important partner in that. It also includes 45 economic advisors that we deployed in 30 countries within ministries of finance and planning to support development of green recovery plans. So bringing the climate expertise into the Ministry of Finance to ensure that climate change was integrated into that recovery. The other, well, there are several other service offerings in the strategy that involve critical capacity building efforts. And these are some areas that donors can focus on as well. And I won't go into detail on them, but just wanted to lay out the ideas quickly for you to reflect on. The first we've heard a lot about is on improving enabling environments. And so providing capacity building around legal, regulatory, financial context in which NDC action takes place and how financing is deployed. We also see large capacity development needs around the actual development of finance or investment strategies. So this is often something that sounds easier, but once we get into the details, knowing how to put those plans together in a way that will make them accessible to the various international funders is a challenge. We're also looking at some of the finance challenges within the central banks and working with central banks expertise that they need, projects, finance. So through the net, we're often, through our knowledge and learning work, really looking to highlight some of these successes that have taken place and ensuring that what works in particular countries and context can be scaled and replicated across the membership. So wanted to extend that invitation to delegates today to participate in our work.
Thank you very much, Amanda, for describing what the Ndc Partnership is doing. And I think you mentioned the importance of building that institutional capacity and retention and not to rely only on these fly-in, fly-out modalities. Thanks for the invitation too. So let me turn now to Anwi, and the question would be, and we heard already about country ownership. So based on your experience in Ghana, how do you think donors can foster country ownership through capacity development?
Thank you again for the opportunity to also contribute to this discussion. But when it comes to country ownership in this case and how donors can actually foster this ownership, there are a number of ways, but as you indicated, I have to be straight to the point. First of all, I would like to also re-echo the issue of strengthening institutional capacity by donor. In the past, some countries have actually relied on consultancies in assessing climate financing. And once a project is able to be financed, the ideas, the intentions actually remains with the consultant who actually develop these concept notes and then the project ideas. It is very important that if you want to enhance and sustain capacity, then we have to actually rely on institutions and then capacities that are in country. And for Ghana, for example, most of the work that we've been doing with UNEP, with the NDC Partnership, with all the donors, actually focus on working through what we call working groups instead of individual consultants. And so we have established quite a number of working groups that we work with. And so donors who are willing to work with our country rather have to actually enhance these working groups so that capacity is enhanced and maintained in country. I think that is one of the suggestions that I can put forward. The second one has to do with what I call donor emphasizing on the establishment and then maintaining what I call climate change capacity academy. What do I mean by this? You know, instead of actually picking and then pinpointing as and when a project comes up, as a donor and then works with. How or why can't maybe donors, for example, come together in country to support an academy that has the sole intention of training and building continuous capacity in-house, so that in country, this continuous support can be remained in country. Once donors actually put resources together from the EU, from the GIZ, from the World Bank, from the whatever donor that is in country, for instance, in Ghana, supporting this idea of climate capacity academy, you have continuous capacity developed and maintained for successive usage. And that will actually even reduce risk for these donor support projects in country. So that's one of the ways that long-term can be also supported. And then also one of the things that I also want to encourage is to avoid projectized activities in country. Instead of looking at programs, a lot of things that we've seen in this country has been piloting and piloting and piloting on small scale basis. Some of these pilot projects never get upskilled or replicated elsewhere in country. And so once some of these project ideas have been formulated, you have to have in mind that this is going to be long-term and it has a sustainability plan, if not only going to be continuous by the donor himself or herself, at least there is a sustainability plan that can be carried forward by whichever institution wants to take or leverage upon this kind of ideas. And so we have to, as much as possible, avoid this, what you call piloting, and rather focusing on programming so that others can actually plug in. In that case, we'll be able to actually support continuous capacity internally. And finally, I think what we cannot avoid today is private sector financing. However, capacity internally in most developing countries is something that is not so much to be desired. And so how do we actually have strategies to actually continuously and consciously build capacity for private sector finance leveraging? Once you have the enabling structures in place as a country, you'll be able to unlock this private sector. But putting up this enabling environment is also very expensive and costly and time consuming. And so how can donors actually partner with private sector entities in country, working with government structures to be able to have enhanced structures that will support private sector financing for climate action? I think these and many other things that we can talk of once we come off donor leveraging. And those are the experiences that I want to actually share with you.
Thank you very much. And very important points, private sector, the academies, which I think is a very interesting concept, the issue of going up to scale to programming and not to piloting. So thank you so much. Karen, now for you, we have a bit of an elaborated question, but please bear with us. Are there alternative entry points for implementing climate action in Pacific seats, and how are capacity and finance issues intertwined in this context? It's a bit of a complex question, but please go ahead.
It's a bit of a complex question. And I guess it kind of comes off the back of the first intervention where we really evaluated, the efficacy and the impact and the equity and the sustainability and appropriateness of those CBA initiatives. And I guess over that 3 years, we were quite surprised that there were so many inherent challenges and limitations with funding and implementing projects at the community level. And that was the preferred level of entry for adaptation financing in these specific countries. So then it really made us stop and think, are there alternative ways or more radical entry points to deliver adaptation for improved outcomes? And I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater here. I don't want us to all of a sudden now no longer do any kind of community-based adaptation delivery, but it more expand our thinking about what's possible about how we might implement adaptation projects, but through different avenues. So in Vanuatu, where I've mainly worked and lived for over 15 years, we found some alternative entry points. So I was just going to present them here now, just as a way, we're finding these entry points that are less charged with these assumptions, because that's really the problem with community. And we've known that through, you know, decades of development intervention failures, because there's assumptions around community being harmonious and stable and fixed and static, and, you know, doesn't have internal conflicts and power relations and inequality. And so climate adaptation financing coming over the top of that, those things really influence and shape then who loses, who wins, and who misses out when it comes to those adaptation benefits. So entry points, alternative entry points. So one of the first ones we found was these technical colleges in Vanuatu, because they're very common throughout Vanuatu, and you get all these students coming from all over the country to these rural technical colleges to skill up in agriculture and hospitality and tourism. So there was this one rural technical college right up in the north of the country that actually was running these adaptation projects around food and water security. So they had fish farms and chicken co-ops, and had developed really good water security infrastructure. And really these projects were managed in these colleges, but then these students would go back to their local villages and pass on those skills and knowledge sets. And so you get these benefits going across the country through these this entry point of delivering adaptation knowledge and skills and actual projects through the rural technical colleges. The second alternative entry point that we found is a whole of island approach. So rather than focusing in on the villages, look at a whole ecological system. So we found this island that was actually made up of 4 villages in the central of Vanuatu, and they'd run projects around, had been delivered around managing crown of thorns starfish. And we know that under climate change and more acidified waters, that these coral eating starfish just grow more kind of ravenous. And so it is something that we should be really looking at. But this project had been implemented a number of years ago, and it was this kind of whole island community, because it was that resource was so people depended on it for their livelihoods. Everyone was involved, everyone was benefiting from it. And so it really struck a chord with us that could be an alternative entry point at this entire socio-ecological system, a really credible entry point, because it brought in all users of that ecosystem, and they all had this shared responsibility. The third alternative entry point that we found was marketplaces. So 75 to 90% of vendors in the Pacific are women. So these marketplaces are significant spaces for women's everyday lives. So women, very similar to the technical colleges, whereas women coming from all these outer islands, they sleep at the marketplaces on cold concrete floors. But and so there's lots of issues that are going on there around safety and security and comfort and so on. But they're these incredible sites where social network is just built, that people learn all these new types of skills. And again, those skills can get taken back to around adaptation, and particularly disaster risk recovery. There have been some projects in there by UN Women. And then you see this flow on domino effect throughout the country. So I guess in summary, the key is that there are alternative entry points at the local scale that can really help and offer some hope in improving adaptation outcomes.
Karen, great. Thank you so much for these 3 very well structured entry points addressing this whole of island approach. I think that's great. Issues about the role of women and the technical college. I find that super interesting too. Let me now turn over to Vanya to ask, based on your experience in the Commonwealth, have you been able to share lessons or experiences amongst countries, and how could donors tap into these experiences to scale up action and build capacity? So over to you, Lefan.
Yeah, so in Pacific region or in the Commonwealth region, so all the countries are not at the same stage. Some countries are middle income countries, some countries are lower income, some countries are high income capacities. So institutional development or the sectoral penetration in all the regions or all the countries are very, very different. So you can run a lot of things unreplicated. For example, We are, as I said, that we are currently trying to deploy electric mobility there in Fiji Island by creating a facility. I mean, initially, we are thinking to create a grant kind of structure where we can subsidize the local transport operators to buy electric buses, because all these countries, they're still heavily relying on oils for their transportations. So they are importing oil, so which is very, very polluting in nature, as you know, that's climate mitigating. So the first stage is to electrification of the transportation. So that we are trying in Fiji. So the first is that we can use some of the donor capital in buying electric buses, try to set up some infrastructure. Then secondly, once there is a learning by the private sector, they can understand the dynamics and economics and the technical aspect of electric buses. Then we are also trying to create some kind of facility or fund where you can mobilize public capital as well as domestic capital as well. For example, the domestic financial institutions in Fiji, so they don't have much understanding about electric mobility. So we're trying to mobilize, blend both the domestic private capital as well as some public capital so that the money can go to the private sector to buy electric vehicles. So that's the second stage we're trying to do. So there are a lot of interest that's also coming from ADB and World Bank to accelerate the deployment of electric mobility in Fiji. So what we are trying, the same lessons can go to other countries as well. Other countries, particularly in the Pacific regions, who are still relying on imported diesel, which is very, very expensive for these countries as well, compared to other countries who are importing diesel or petrol for the electric transportation. So we are going to try the same thing, particularly initially using grant capital to demonstrate the commercial feasibility of electric mobility in the country, which is essential. So that's the first stage. The second stage is to make it commercially feasible. Although I understand that it will not be a perfectly commercial feasible projects, particularly electric mobility. It will take some time, but at least if you demonstrate the commercial financer or the public financer the success of your projects, so there will be lessons that can be learned. Similarly, we have seen success in other countries like Namibia. So they are currently running a revolving financing facility by the Ministry of Finance. Although the source of capital is coming from the government exchequer, but what they are smartly doing, they are providing capital at a concessional rate to the segment which are not financeable, so that they can buy solar heaters, solar water pump. And if this kind of households, if they go to commercial banks, they are not denying to provide capital. So they are still using the fossil fuels or wood for their cooking purpose. So how can we help them to buy solar water heater, for example, or solar cooking system? That's not possible without getting concessional capital. What they are doing, they are providing concessional capital. The term of loan is very, very moderate, or the terms of credit is good for the beneficiaries. So they can buy the solar system so that after 2 to 3 years, they can pay back to the facility. Then the facility can again provide capital. So here we are not discussing about purely grant capital given to the beneficiaries. We are talking about a revolving facility. The same money can be recycled time and again. The same model we are also trying to deploy in other countries, in particular to the unserved segment, who are not bankable in the Pacific region countries or any other country you touch. So this kind of model can be very, very successful. Then the third aspect we are also learning, particularly multi-year climate adaptation projects. So when we are talking about multi-year project preparation support, which is essential. Particularly what happens that when we discuss about planning, we are talking about very, very short-term, medium-term planning, which is not good for this country, particularly the countries which needs to invest a lot of capital in climate resilient infrastructure. Here you are talking about setting up facilities or investing in assets which will stay for next 20 to 50 years, which is essential. In that case, if we are getting grant capital only preparation for a year, that's not fruitful. That is not going to help you a lot. So in this context, so you need to have a multi-year project planning. So you plan for a couple of years and then set up the infrastructure, invest in the climate resilient infrastructure, so that the assets can be there for a long period of time, rather than you take decision very hastily, thinking that, okay, my money is only for a year or two, I need to spend that money, rather than thinking over a long period of time, what is the best or optimum solution for the country. That also we are trying to do in trying to share knowledge or lessons among various countries in the region. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Giovanni. Thank you for those very good examples, Namibia, Fiji, and how you're applying those models, instruments, and how they could be taken to other countries, of course, adapted to their national context. So now we'll turn over to Nadesh. I think, Nadesh, you already sort of addressed parts of this question in your first intervention, but she would like to hear about what would you recommend partner countries and donors to do to enhance capacity of developing countries to access climate finance.
Yes, thank you, Alejandro. Indeed, I already started to answer this question during the first intervention, but maybe I can take advantage of what has been discussed with the other speakers, because I really like the intervention of Mr. Anti. I think it's very rich intervention, and this need of academy and this need of programming instead of piloting. I think we still need to learn from this, and I really appreciated it. I think that maybe something I would like to share from our experience of the way we see countries are starting to structure themselves, to organize themselves, to ensure there is a connectivity between the different programs and the different initiatives in the country, is this creation of kind of steering committee as well as technical working groups, and which remain more or less the same according to the programs and the different initiatives that are ongoing in the country, and they are just amended according to the sectors. For example, some initiatives or program will be very multi-sectoral, others will be mainly focusing on water, for example, but the people that participate in all these initiatives remain the same, so they know exactly what is going on in all the in the country, what is the strategic line, and yeah, where do we want to go, what is the challenge and the commitment of the country. And I think that has demonstrated to work very well at the time of implementation, because it creates very rich debates and very concrete decisions. So this would be maybe one of the thing I would like to add. And maybe just to come back also on this academy, because it's very interesting idea, and it reminds me of something that was requested from DRC for the TNA, where they specifically requested to integrate an activity in which small companies and youth people could present climate technology projects during a kind of award ceremony, which would be related to the sectors and to the priorities and technologies that would be identified in the TNA, and that the program will select and encourage the selected initiatives to train them to speak and to help them designing a bankable business model, and to help them in really finalizing both their communications and the financial aspects. And then at the end of the activity, there will be a competition between the 5 selected programs, and they will get a reward from the country, so that they can continue implementing their ideas. And I think that this is related to this idea of involving the private sectors with incentives. So if you are selected as the best technology for this TNA, for example, then you will get a reward, and then you will get support from the country to move forward in the next steps. And I think it's a very interesting idea that could be easily replicated, and it also rings a bell a little bit with other initiatives that are undertaken by UNFCCT on the youth labs and climate innovation labs and youth competitions to make sure that the private sector and as well as gender and youth can express their idea and can benefit from the support of the donors. So yes, I think I will end with that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nadesh, for building up on what others have saying, and that example linked to the academy and the involvement of youth. So thank you very much. And that wraps up this panel discussion. And I really want to thank our panelists. Fortunately, and we had to leave because he had to go to a meeting with the GCF talking about climate finance. So but really appreciate all the very insightful interventions from our panelists, and I'm sure it gives a lot of food for thought to go into our breaking groups. So again, thank you very much. So now we'll hand it over back to Juan, please, to introduce us to the breakout groups. Thank you very much. Juan, you're muted.
Juan, you're on mute.
Yeah, so apologies for that. I was just saying thank you also on my behalf for all the insights that the panelists have given us, and we will be breaking out in groups. We're slightly behind schedule, but not a lot, just 5 minutes. We're going to break out into 3 groups. The first group on effective solutions, the second on seeds, the third on the private sector. We've tried to allocate you based on your preferences, but sometimes that was not possible. We didn't have information, so unfortunately we'll have to randomize some of you. We need to physically move to other rooms, so give us a few minutes, and then we'll be back online in 1-2 minutes.
Hello, everyone. Without an echo. I could have a quick note from somebody in the virtual breakout room. Yeah, there's an echo. Is it better now without the echo? We're just trying for you to have a good audio experience in this breakout room session, so bear with us. Is it better now?
That's good, Özlem.
Hi, Paula. Is it okay now with the echo? Or?
I can hear you well without echo.
Yeah, okay, great. Then let's do kick this breakout off. Well, welcome first of all to the breakout group session on private sector. We have heard references to the private sector in the panel in the first panel already quite a lot, and so we're very much looking forward to this discussion here. I want to say a few words before we really kick off the discussion. So first, on the structure, we will have 4 presentations, starting out with an overview of the challenge at hand. So what are the barriers, what are the main challenges for the private sector in developing countries to access climate-related finance. And then we're going to go into 3 other presentations that are looking into more concrete proposed solutions to address this challenge. The aim is the following for the breakout. Well, we have 3 aims for the breakout group session. And they're all around very much what we're looking forward is for interaction with everyone and among everyone in the group. So this means the panelists, the 4 panelists that we have, but also the participants. So we hope we'll have enough time for discussion with the participants as well. We're really looking forward to an interactive exchange with you and to create and share information on the challenges, the reflections on lessons learned, what are some of the emerging good practice approaches, but also what we're looking for is very much not just to understand what works and what doesn't work, but what are also the factors, the success factors, but also the hindering challenges behind why things might work or might not work. And the reason why we're looking very much forward to this interactive exchange, because the discussion will very much feed into a formalized guidance of the OECD on the topic. So access to climate-related finance for the private sector in developing countries. That was my second point. The third point before we kick off the discussion is just very, very short an introduction of the speakers, of the panelists. Let me pull back a little bit. My name is Özlem Taşkın. I work in the team that is headed by Jens, so the team within the OECD that is looking after everything environment and climate change related to developing countries. Yes, so regarding the speakers, we have 4 speakers. We will kick off with Miss Marie-Andrée Lière, who is adaptation specialist from the Climate Resilience Fund. And as I mentioned, she will kick us off with an overview of the situation. So what are some of the main barriers for SMEs in developing countries to access climate-related finance? We will then head over to Ms. Fatou Diana Ba, who is director or directrice from the Bureau Mise à Niveau des Entreprises from Senegal. Her presentation will be in French. And we also have, I'm just gonna glance over to Sam, we have a translation service in this breakout group as well. So you can use the service as well, because the presentation by Ms. Fatou Diana Ba will be in French. Third presentation will be by Ms. Paula Rolz, who is advisor for Partnering for Readiness, which is a project by the German GIZ, or German Development Cooperation Agency. And she will provide an overview on support provided at this program of German Development Cooperation on enhancing access to finance, looking both at the finance sector, but then also the private sector, with a focus on adaptation. And then the last presentation will be by Mr. Maxime Sauvigné, who is the climate analytics team lead at United Nations University, and who will present a project from UNU, like it's a co-project, but UNU is very much part of this, in Honduras, where the economics of climate adaptation has been applied, and there we will see how climate risk data is actually very much linked to access to climate-related finance. So without further ado, let me then kick off or hand over the virtual mic to Ms. Marie-Andrée Lière. And Marie, just a couple of guiding questions for your presentations as well. In your experience, what are some of the main bottlenecks that the private sector faces when it comes to accessing climate finance? Maybe one of the first framing questions. And then secondly, how is the Landscape Resilience Funds targeting these bottlenecks, and what kind of results are you seeing or are you expecting from current projects in this respect? Over to you, Marie.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much, Özlem, and good day, everyone. Firstly, I would like to thank you for having me and the opportunity to present here the Landscape Resilience Fund, LRF in short, in this session. Also very interesting to see all the learnings and experiences from other colleagues in this space. So the LRF is managed by South Pole, and that in collaboration with the Worldwide Fund for Nature, WWF, we have developed the LRF which is an international nonprofit fund which aims to leverage financial streams into focused landscape-based adaptation and resilience projects. So the LRF has secured so far 25 million US dollars in private anchor funding from Chanel, and an additional 1.3 million US dollars as a winner of the Jeff Challenge program. So this funding comes from the Global Environmental Facility. Next, please. And you can skip a couple of slides. Next and next. And yes, in case you haven't heard of or you don't know, South Pole is a climate change consultants service provider. We develop from finance projects to reduce carbon emissions and bring benefits to communities, to taking companies achieving climate neutrality or net zero. But also South Pole works with clients across the private and public sector on structuring and managing pools of capital that deliver climate assets and impact. And it's in this point where the LRF was conceived. Next slide, please. I will leave you here some more information if you want to know more about South Pole, our global reach, and our impact. Next slide, please. And maybe we'll jump directly to the Landscape Resilience Fund, which is the next one. And please go to the next one. So the LRF, its vision is to enable the most vulnerable people in specific landscapes to effectively adapt to climate change by mobilizing finance for commerce, communities, and conservation. And as I mentioned before, South Pole is the admin manager of the fund in collaboration with WWF that is working as a service advisor. And if you can go to the next slide, you will see how the fund is structured. And how it works is basically that there is a structure of the LRF. And as I mentioned before, we are starting from an initial anchor investment and public funding. And we are currently in a big fundraising campaign to increase the pool of the fund. But the LRF basically contributes to increasing access to finance by working across two main pillars, which are based to address the barriers that we have identified, that we have previously identified, and have also been mentioned here before as this bottleneck. So, for example, on the one side, how do we manage and accommodate multiple land uses, social, economic, and environmental trade-offs, and at the same time ensure participation and resource problems. But there's also a lack of knowledge and capacity about economically viable climate resilience practices, or there is little access to adaptation-focused investors. There is low, for SMEs and small businesses, there's high costs and risks associated with a change of practices. And finally, of course, there is a lack of track record to access financial support for capital that normal or traditional banks generally, stop the SMEs for going forward. So our fund then is based on these two main pillars that target to tackle these challenges. So one of them is supporting climate resilient SMEs through SME investments. This is basically this you can see at the bottom of the structure on orange. So on the one hand side, soft loans that are provided to SMEs to provide concessional loans that are flexible and with low interest rates to SMEs to finance the implementation of sustainable land management activities, among others, but also working for working capital or scaling or replicating pilot projects. And on the other side, and I've highlighted this here because it's our pre-investment support window, which is why we're here today in this session. So basically, this is our capacity building for SMEs, providing technical assistance and project preparation for SMEs towards investment readiness and access to other financing opportunities. And last but not least, our second big window, which is the landscape development. It's on the right side in orange under the structure. The LRF activities are grounded in an integrated landscape approach that seeks to reconcile these competing natural resources demands and the community interest to address broader objectives. So this pillar basically allows strengthening this approach to support environmental and social development and governance through these multi-stakeholder platforms. So we also acknowledge that we cannot do everything from scratch and by ourselves. So it is important that we reach out to this and strengthen these partnerships in the landscapes with academia, with the private and public sector. And this is done through local support. It was mentioned before and highlighted several times how this local-led adaptation is key. So we do this by locally supporting through an LRF local landscape coordinator and strengthen these multi-stakeholder platforms. Next one, please. So I will not go into more detail of the LRF. I'm happy to take any questions if there are any afterwards or in a bilateral discussion. But in a nutshell, we are targeting to specific outcomes for the LRF. And in the long-term impact, we hope to have an unlocking finance at scale for communities and landscapes to deal with climate impacts. So we're aiming to have a tangible difference over the long term. That means that with the repaid loans we get back from the supported SMEs, this will be reinvested in other SMEs. So creating through blended finance, a self-sustaining, efficient financing tool for adaptation. Next one, please. So this is, of course, done through the SMEs, which play a major role when it comes to having an impact on the ground and in these rural landscapes. So therefore, by scaling innovative SMEs combined with incentives and safeguards, this enables more people to better adapt to climate change as a basis for rural development. Next one, please. And of course, this has its challenges and there are many barriers still to overcome. As I've mentioned before, there are too many risks for mainstream commercial investments. SMEs don't have the knowledge or expertise, or there are too high costs associated to adaptation practices. So on this sense, maybe you can jump a couple of slides. I want to deep dive into our pre-investment support services. So as I mentioned before, this is in the green square down in our structure of the fund. So this is, yeah, I have to stress that in this section and in this window, the pre-investment support is a winner of the GEF Challenge program. So it is funded by the GEF, and therefore the pre-investment support window has three main purposes. So basically, we want to resolve all the shortcomings that the SMEs have with their business model, or any lack of internal capacities, and also enhance and better monitor the SMEs' impacts and benefits. And finally, we want to make sure that by allowing these two purposes, the SME can also reach to potential private investors. So the purpose of this window is not only build capacity so the LRF can invest in them, but that the SMEs themselves can also reach into a different type of arena out there. Next one, and I'll just go through this very quickly. So how does this work? As I mentioned before, this is mostly, this window is mostly for those SMEs trying to access finance. So how do we overcome this barrier? So we identified some of the most important barriers that the SMEs are facing when searching and applying for finance. These are all listed on the left, these four main ones here. And of course, they might encompass many others that we've identified and that you might also know. But with our planned activities on the gray squares, we target to address such barriers. So these barriers are mainly centered around the lacking of knowledge and the capacity on how to prepare their investment plans, as well as all these high costs that are associated and the risks that are associated with them. And finally, the lack of access to the finance and investors that these SMEs are looking for, and the lack of capacity to monitor and evaluate the impacts. Through these activities, we are targeting to have sustainable processes for provisioning pre-investment services for SMEs to make their business case and to make their practices investment ready. Also increase the technical, operation and financial capacities of the SMEs to structure their business proposals. And finally, that there is an increased capacity of these SMEs to match with private investors. Last one, please, next, yeah. So to achieve these outcomes, we have prepared here a list of the type of services this pre-investment pillar offers. I will not go into detail because there are many of them here, but You can, I hope you can have access out to the slides later on. You can have a more detailed look at it. But basically, these services are tailored in a way so on a case-by-case analysis, given that SMEs have their own specific needs, their own specific barriers and challenges, that this is tailored on a case-by-case analysis. And of course, this is not an exhaustive list, but also rather to show you a type of activity we could finance. So from development of their business model and marketing opportunities to even contributing, maybe you can go to the next one, to the contributing to building up a training program for the farmers the SMEs work with, strengthening adaptive capacity, etc. And maybe you can skip to the next slide. So I'll leave you here also the targets or the impacts we're targeting through this Jeff Challenge program and this investment readiness window. And maybe you can go to the last one. Also, just to finally mention here that since this is part of a Jeff Challenge program, we also have to mention a grievance mechanism that we communicate with when we engage with our stakeholders and with our SMEs. But also, if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to us. Yeah, and I'll leave it to that. In the last slide, you can see the team, including myself there. And yeah, happy to the conversation, and thank you for the space.
Great, thanks so much. So much, Marie. Good. Yeah, good. Okay. Thanks so much, Marie, for this overview of the challenges and all of the work that we are doing at LRF to address these challenges. This was a great kickoff. Let's pass on to Ms. Fatou Diana Ba. And I saw that she is online to get an overview of the mise à niveau des entreprises from Senegal and all of the work that you're doing there to address some of the challenges that Marie has just identified.
Bonjour tout le monde. Et merci beaucoup. D'abord, je voudrais commencer par remercier l'OCDE pour nous permettre de participer à cet atelier et donc qui nous permet de présenter les activités du bureau de mise à niveau. Le bureau de mise à niveau, c'est une structure qui dépend du ministère du Commerce et des PME au Sénégal et qui a pour objet d'accompagner les entreprises du secteur privé pour l'amélioration de leur compétitivité. Donc, c'est un bureau qui a été mis en place depuis 2004 et qui, donc, depuis, a pu faire beaucoup d'activités, notamment avec l'appui de certains partenaires. Alors, j'espère que, bon, je parle en français, mais j'espère que la traduction se passe bien et que vous entendez bien ce que je suis en train de présenter. Donc, je voudrais d'abord présenter rapidement le dispositif de la mise à niveau, ensuite présenter les appuis que nous apportons aux entreprises et enfin, dans le domaine spécifique du développement durable, présenter un projet que nous sommes en train de mener actuellement qui est un projet dénommé Projet Ville Durable. Diapo. Voilà, donc comme je le disais, le bureau a été créé en 2004 avec pour objectif d'accompagner le secteur privé dans l'amélioration de sa compétitivité. Donc ça suppose qu'on trouve des entreprises qui sont dans des secteurs d'activité assez diversifiés et on va les accompagner pour structurer leurs projets de développement et voir comment on peut faire pour qu'elles puissent vraiment grandir, bien se comporter sur leur marché, notamment sur les marchés intérieurs, mais également sur les marchés à l'export. Diapo. Voilà. Donc, en dehors de cet aspect d'accompagnement des entreprises, nous sommes également appelés à jouer un peu un rôle dans tout ce qui est environnement des affaires, mais également au niveau du secteur du conseil. Donc, nous appuyons également les consultants, les bureaux d'études qui collaborent avec nous pour voir comment également faire un renforcement de leur capacité. Voilà, alors le dispositif donc, du bureau de mise à niveau, donc, comme je le disais, nous sommes dans une structure qui est logée au sein du ministère du Commerce et des PME. Nous faisons partie d'un dispositif global, donc l'État du Sénégal a mis en place un certain nombre de structures pour accompagner le secteur privé. Donc le bureau de mise à niveau est une de ces structures-là, justement. Et nous avons la particularité d'avoir donc deux organes qui sont le bureau de mise à niveau, qui est l'organe opérationnel. Nous avons également le fonds de mise à niveau, qui est un fonds qui est destiné à accompagner les actions que nous menons en faveur des entreprises du secteur privé. Et en 2010, donc, le bureau de mise à niveau a intégré dans cet accompagnement au secteur privé le volet du développement durable, puisqu'au début, c'était plutôt question d'accompagner les entreprises dans l'amélioration de leur compétitivité. Mais en 2010, donc, à la faveur de nouveaux programmes qu'on a eu à mettre en place avec des partenaires, notamment l'Agence française de développement et l'Union européenne, donc, nous avons intégré les aspects de développement propre, notamment donc, comment accompagner les entreprises à intégrer dans leur projet de développement des notions de protection de l'environnement, mais également des notions de valorisation des déchets et également voir comment intégrer les aspects d'efficacité énergétique. Donc, le process de la mise à niveau, donc, c'est un process qui est donc assez souple et qui consiste à appuyer l'entreprise d'abord sur une partie diagnostique. Donc, l'entreprise qui va être accompagnée, on va donc d'abord faire un diagnostic de l'entreprise pour voir comment elle peut améliorer son activité. Donc, c'est un diagnostic stratégique global qui va être réalisé. Et à l'intérieur de ce diagnostic, il y aura bien entendu un diagnostic de ses fonctions environnement et également de ses fonctions efficaces et énergétiques qui vont être prises en compte pour déboucher sur un plan d'action que l'entreprise va devoir donc mettre en place pour gagner en compétitivité. Diapo. Oui, on peut passer cette diapo-là. Je pense que j'ai voulu aller vite pour pouvoir rester dans les 10 minutes qui nous sont imparties. Voilà, donc ça, c'est le dispositif opérationnel. Nous avons également peut-être la particularité du bureau de mise à niveau, c'est que c'est un partenariat public-privé. Donc, c'est vraiment l'État qui met à disposition une structure pour accompagner son secteur privé. Et justement, dans les organes de gouvernance, nous avons 2 organes de gouvernance donc, qui pilotent en fait le dispositif de la mise à niveau. Nous avons un comité de pilotage et nous avons un comité de surveillance du fonds de mise à niveau. Et donc, ces 2 organes de gouvernance ont une composition donc, tripartite. Donc, il y a l'État qui est représenté dans ce comité, il y a le secteur privé qui est représenté et il y a également le secteur bancaire qui est représenté dans ce comité pour justement pouvoir étudier et valider les projets des entreprises et les accompagner dans la réalisation de leurs projets. Prochaine diapo. Voilà, donc le fonds de mise à niveau, particulièrement, donc ce sont les ressources qui sont donc à disposition, qui permettent d'accompagner justement ces entreprises, puisque on accompagne sur 2 volets. Il y a un accompagnement technique, comme on l'appelle, pour voir comment l'entreprise va être accompagnée dans la structuration de son projet. Et ensuite, on va avoir un accompagnement financier sous forme de primes. Donc, ce sont des subventions gratuites qu'on va accorder à ces entreprises pour les encourager à aller vers ces projets d'investissement. Donc, c'est l'objet, c'est vraiment d'appuyer le secteur privé à aller vers des investissements de production, mais également, vous le verrez également, donc on intègre également dans ces projets d'investissement ces notions de développement durable. Et donc, ça, c'est bien reflété dans le projet qu'on pourra également présenter tout à l'heure. Donc, le fonds de mise à niveau, donc, ce sont des ressources qui sont mises à disposition pour accorder ces subventions. Et le fonds, donc, est abondé par les ressources de l'État du Sénégal, mais également par les ressources des différents partenaires et bailleurs qui accompagnent le développement du projet. Donc, c'est notamment l'Agence française de développement, je l'ai cité tout à l'heure, l'Union européenne, la coopération allemande, la GIZ, la Banque africaine de développement, et également l'ONUDI, qui est également un partenaire donc, technique du projet, puisque l'ONUDI, donc le concept de mise à niveau, mais également ces notions de développement durable. Donc, l'ONUDI travaille étroitement avec le bureau de mise à niveau sur ces volets-là. Donc, pour revenir maintenant au process de la mise à niveau. Donc, voilà, nous avons au niveau du bureau donc, un groupe donc, des compétences pluridisciplinaires donc, qui accompagnent justement ces entreprises dans la structuration de leurs projets. Donc, nous avons des experts en industrie, en agroéconomie, nous avons des experts en environnement, en efficacité énergétique. Nous avons également des experts financiers pour voir justement sur la faisabilité des projets qui sont présentés, comment faire pour que ce soit des projets qui tiennent la route, qui sont suffisamment bancables pour pouvoir lever des financements au niveau du secteur bancaire. Nous avons également des experts en suivi et évaluation qui sont chargés donc de suivre également le process et de s'assurer que par rapport au projet qui a été donc défini, libellé et approuvé par nos organes de gouvernance, que ce projet donc va également être mis en œuvre selon les règles et selon ce qui avait été donc prévu dès le départ. Et bien entendu, nous avons l'équipe administrative donc qui suit le process. Et nous avons également la particularité donc d'être implanté un peu partout au Sénégal. Donc, je ne sais pas si vous connaissez le Sénégal, mais le Sénégal donc a la particularité d'avoir un développement assez concentré sur la capitale qui est Dakar, mais il y a quand même des structures, donc des entreprises qui quand même essaient de faire des activités économiques dans les autres régions du Sénégal. Et c'est pour ça que nous avons donc fait le pari de pouvoir aller donc rencontrer ces entreprises. Nous avons donc des points focaux qui représentent le bureau donc au niveau de ces régions qui sont excentrées de Dakar, donc au nord, au sud-est et au sud du Sénégal. Voilà, pour revenir maintenant sur le process de la mise à niveau. Donc, c'est un process qui est assez simple, qui est donc schématisé. On passe d'abord par prochaine diapo. Voilà, donc le principe de la mise à niveau, hein, donc on revient sur ça rapidement, c'est donc accompagner l'entreprise pour qu'elle puisse donc améliorer sa compétitivité. Donc ça passe d'abord par un étalonnage, un rattrapage pour se hisser aux meilleures pratiques, donc notamment les pratiques respectueuses de l'environnement, et donc affronter la concurrence étrangère. Donc ça, c'est le concept même de la mise à niveau. Et le process de la mise à niveau, donc pour y arriver, next diapo. Voilà, donc les étapes de la mise à niveau. Donc, nous avons 5 étapes clés pour la mise à niveau des entreprises. On va d'abord commencer par l'adhésion de l'entreprise qui donc décide de présenter un projet donc, au niveau du bureau de mise à niveau. Donc, une fois qu'elle adhère, donc, on va vérifier son éligibilité puisque nous avons des secteurs que nous couvrons. Donc, en général, ce sont tous les secteurs d'activité qui sont productifs. C'est notamment l'industrie, c'est le secteur de l'agriculture également, c'est le secteur des TIC, le secteur de la santé, bref, tout ce qui est activité de production. Et une fois que donc cette entreprise a adhéré au programme, nous avons passé à la deuxième étape qui est l'étape du diagnostic. Donc, c'est un diagnostic qui va être réalisé au niveau de l'entreprise pour voir comment on peut améliorer sa compétitivité, voir sur quel mécanisme, sur quel point on pourrait agir pour permettre à cette entreprise donc de mieux se comporter sur son marché. Donc, c'est la deuxième étape. On peut passer. Et le diagnostic va déboucher donc sur la formulation d'un plan de mise à niveau. Donc, c'est un projet d'investissement, comme nous l'appelons, que nous allons donc présenter à notre structure de gouvernance, notamment le comité de pilotage, qui va étudier le projet et qui va le valider. Et si le projet est validé, donc le comité de pilotage va donc supporter cette entreprise en donnant des primes à cette entreprise. Donc, ce sont des primes, des subventions qu'on va donner à cette entreprise pour l'encourager à faire son investissement, mais à côté de ces primes que l'entreprise va donc recevoir, l'entreprise aura également à donc faire un financement qui lui est propre pour pouvoir donc mettre en place son projet d'investissement. Donc, selon la taille de l'entreprise, donc nous avons également un secteur privé qui est assez diversifié et disparate, de telle sorte que nous avons au fur et à mesure donc adapté notre offre de services. Donc, nous avons des grandes entreprises pour lesquelles on parle de la mise à niveau globale et nous avons des entreprises de plus petite taille, vraiment des très petites et micro-entreprises pour lesquelles donc on va sur la mise à niveau spécifique. Et donc, la mise à niveau spécifique est calée sur un délai d'1 an de réalisation, alors que la mise à niveau globale peut aller sur un délai de 3 ans. Et une fois donc que l'entreprise réalise son projet, elle va donc pouvoir bénéficier de ces primes, donc ces accompagnements que le bureau met en place pour justement l'accompagner dans son projet d'investissement. Donc, ce sont des primes avec des taux diversifiés, donc ce sont des taux de 20 à 40% sur l'investissement matériel et de 70% sur l'investissement immatériel. Donc, l'investissement immatériel, ça va être un accompagnement sur des études de marché, sur des certifications, sur la mise en place ou l'accompagnement en fait, de l'assistance technique, alors que les investissements matériels vont concerner tout ce qui sont investissements de production, investissements d'augmentation de capacité, mais également quelquefois des investissements qui ont donc un caractère, par exemple, gestion des déchets ou traitement des eaux usées ou mise en place de systèmes de valorisation de l'énergie, notamment l'énergie solaire, etc.
Juste,
oui. Voilà, donc pour donner quelques chiffres, donc depuis le bureau de mise à niveau est en place, notamment de 2017 à 2021. Donc, on a quelques chiffres qui donnent donc un exemple du nombre d'entreprises qu'on a eu à accompagner. Donc, de 2017 à 2021, nous sommes à 454 conventions qui ont été signées avec ces entreprises. Next diapo. Voilà, donc là également, c'est pour montrer que nous sommes donc installés un peu partout au Sénégal. Donc, nous avons des entreprises qui sont un peu partout, avec des entreprises plus agricoles dans la zone nord et dans la zone sud-sud-est, et des entreprises plutôt industrielles, donc concentrées au niveau donc de la région de Dakar. Voilà, donc comme on l'a expliqué là, donc près de 80% des entreprises que nous accompagnons donc sont dans le secteur de l'agriculture et de l'agro-industrie.
Fatou, il nous reste 17 minutes maintenant et il nous reste aussi deux autres présentations. Et si on a le temps, ça serait très utile si on a aussi les temps pour une Q&A avec les autres participants. Donc, si on peut finir votre intervention, serait utile pour le...
Tout à fait, tout à fait. Donc voilà, on passe à la partie la plus intéressante. Donc c'est un projet qu'on a eu à dérouler, donc un projet nommé Initiative Ville Durable, où il s'agissait donc d'accompagner des entreprises justement dans des projets de production propre, avec l'objectif de promouvoir la démarche de production propre dans les parcs industriels, avec 1 mégawatt d'énergie renouvelable installée ou 1 mégawatt d'énergie conventionnelle évitée, et 6780 tonnes de CO2 évitées. 4 microgrammes TEC par an de POPs. Et dans le contenu, donc dans les activités dont nous avons eu, donc on passe à la diapo suivante. Ça, c'est les objectifs qui étaient prévus. Donc, ce qui a été réalisé effectivement. Voilà, donc on a eu à faire des activités donc de diagnostic RCP, des activités de renforcement de capacité, notamment sur les volets efficacité énergétique, développement durable, mise en place du système de management de l'environnement, des études de faisabilité. Et sur les projets pilotes donc, qui ont été donc proposés, nous en avons donc retenu 13. Et les entreprises sont également accompagnées sur la mise en place de systèmes de management de l'énergie et de systèmes de management de l'environnement.
Ok, super. Merci Fatou. Avec ça, est-ce qu'on peut aller au Paula Wolf from GIZ pour la troisième présentation? Il nous reste 15 minutes pour les...
Oui, excusez-moi, c'est bon, on a pris un peu plus de temps que c'était prévu. Peut-être juste la dernière diapo qui présente les objectifs donc, du bureau de mise à niveau sur les prochaines... voilà. Voilà, donc sur les impacts de ce projet, donc on a eu 12 projets pilotes qui ont été accompagnés avec des impacts économiques, notamment sur le montant des énergies conventionnelles évitées de 4 451 millions de francs CFA, l'impact énergétique sur les 10 ans et un impact environnemental. Et enfin, les next steps pour le bureau de mise à niveau, c'est la dernière diapo, si vous voulez bien. On y passe rapidement. Voilà, donc ce sont des projets que nous comptons donc dérouler prochainement, notamment c'est une continuité sur le projet Initiative Ville Durable. Et enfin, un projet d'atténuation et d'adaptation au changement climatique, donc accompagner 100 PME en zone rurale pour l'amélioration de leur compétitivité par le remplacement notamment de générateurs diesel par des installations solaires et le renforcement de la résilience au changement climatique par la mise en œuvre de pratiques de gestion durable. Et enfin, nous sommes également en train de mettre en œuvre donc des formations sur la finance verte avec la collaboration de RENAC. Merci beaucoup pour votre attention. Et puis, on est là, donc peut-être éventuellement, s'il y a des questions, on pourra compléter la présentation. Merci encore.
Merci beaucoup, Fatou. Avec ça, I will pass the floor to Paula Rolfs. Before I do that, if I could ask both Paula and Maxime to limit their presentation to the most essential parts, we will see that we can still have both of your presentations. But if I could also see if somebody from the participants would be willing to be the rapporteur when we go back to the plenary. Sébastien from Belgium, I see you raise your hand. Is that for the rapporteur?
Yes, indeed.
Great, thanks so much. So with that, over to Paula for her presentation from GIZ's program on access to climate finance.
Yeah, thank you, Özlem, and hello everyone. Very happy to be here. So my name is Paula Rolfs, and I'm working at GIZ in a project called Partnering for Readiness. And I will indeed try to be brief with my presentation today. So GIZ is a federal enterprise and implements international cooperation projects, mostly technical assistance, on behalf of its commissioners, mostly the German government, but also other donors, such as the EU, but also Green Climate Fund, for example. And we work with over 120 partner countries, mostly through projects and offices on the ground. And I'll now present the work of our project, Partnering for Readiness, which focuses on improving access to climate finance, particularly in the context of the Green Climate Fund. And I also present some other initiatives and projects working with the private sector in particular. So firstly, I would like to give you a very general overview of financial flows in the context of climate change and the private sector, as well as the interlinkages of financial system and private sector and related capacity building needs, where the GIZ projects that I present today are working on. So on the macro level, there's the financial system and the need of shifting financial flows from gray to green, so greening finance. And this can take place through various regulations and guidelines, including climate risk management, disclosure requirements, and taxonomies, for example. And that's also where our project Partnering for Readiness is working on, but I'll go into a bit of detail later on. Then on the next level, the meso level, there are the financial institutions and investors providing finance. So financing green projects, activities, services, etc. These actors are well influenced by the rules and regulations of the financial system. And they are central intermediaries that provide finance to the private sector ultimately. And then, well, lastly, the private sector, the real economy, receives this finance. And it would be very nice if finance would flow so smoothly towards climate compatible activities as shown on this very simplified figure. But in reality, there are, as you know, a lot of challenges. For example, Marie just presented a few with regards to SMEs. Yeah, and that's where capacity building can come into play. Access to climate finance and capacity building support play a role really on all of these three levels. In the following, I'll give you two examples from our project, Partnering for Readiness, and a sister project, Private Adaptation Finance, that focuses, as the title suggests, on finance for private sector adaptation. The next slide, please. So our project, Partnering for Readiness, has inter alia the role of coordinating GIZ's role as delivery partner of the Green Climate Fund Readiness Program. We've heard about that already earlier today. the GCF's readiness program is a dedicated funding window of the GCF with the goal of enabling countries to directly access the fund and other sources of climate finance. I've included the link in my presentation for further reference. And being a delivery partner of the readiness program means that we get approached by countries who would like to partner with us in implementing these readiness funds. And currently we are supporting Morocco and Thailand, including on GCF project development. And we are also supporting a community of practice of direct access entities, as well as a SIDS initiative. Beyond this targeted support, we connect countries and organizations and have several initiatives and trainings for the global transfer of knowledge and experiences on climate finance access. For example, South-South exchange networks. We are also acting as a sparring partner to the GCF, providing input and feedback and co-creating learning platforms and knowledge products. And all that with the objectives of strengthening national ownership and improving the enabling environment that has also been mentioned so many times today for mobilizing investment in mitigation and adaptation. Next slide, please. So an example for that, the enabling environment, is a study that we are currently conducting on climate compatible financial system development. And that includes case studies from Mexico, South Africa, Thailand, and Uganda. And we analyze the current development initiatives, roles of the institutions in the financial system in order to identify opportunities, challenges, and capacity building needs. So I'll dive a bit deeper now in how this analysis is being done, as this can also be used in other countries and contexts. The next slide, please. So colleagues of mine, together with Frankfurt School, have developed a tool called the Sustainable Finance Policy Navigator. The Navigator has the objective to assist partner countries in developing a sustainable finance strategy and reform plans to navigate the transition to sustainable economies. And it can be used for public institutions, but also financial regulators and also central banks, for example. And it follows the approach of a structured advisory that's supported by a diagnostic tool to guide partner countries on sustainable finance reforms. And it is structured in 6 fields of action by 5 stakeholder groups, and thus yielding in a multi-dimensional menu of actions. That sounds maybe a little bit complex, but just to give you an example, one field of action can be data, standardization, and disclosure. And this is very relevant because without sufficient and reliable data and information disclosure, financial markets may price or value assets incorrectly, thus resulting in a misallocation of capital. And I put here on the slide a link to the Navigator itself, and also a link to the outcome of applying the Navigator within a GIZ project in Brazil. So also in case you have any questions on the tool, please contact my colleague who's shown there. And as I understand, all the presentations will be shared afterwards, so you can click on the sources later on. Then on the last slide, I'll briefly present the project Private Adaptation Finance, which works further downstream with investors and SMEs. So we are now reaching the kind of meso and micro level. And the project seeks to help make the business case for adaptation and unlock the constrained potential of private actors to finance and facilitate both their own and others' adaptation and resilience to climate change. And it does so through 3 pillars. And the first one is support to the private equity fund Craft. And it's providing tailored advisory services for 7 portfolio companies of Craft for the strategic market introduction of adaptation relevant technologies and services to ultimately increase resilience of the most vulnerable. The second pillar is knowledge management, and it includes the dissemination of innovative practices for private adaptation businesses and financing models, and that way raising awareness on the necessity and opportunities of adaptation investment. And then, yeah, it's my last point.
Yeah, we have that. Otherwise, we'll cut you off.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Yeah, so the third pillar provides technical assistance, peer learning, and networking for SMEs. I'll not go into much more detail because we have also heard similar approaches from the LRF's pre-investment support services and also the BMN project in Senegal. And with that, I'm closing my presentation. Many thanks for your attention. We can't hear you, Özlem.
We're about to be moved to the plenary room. Let us just check internally what we can do with Maxime's presentation on the economics of climate adaptation project in Honduras. And then we will get back to you. But Sam, we're about to be moved to the breakout, to the main session, to the plenary, right? Yeah, all right. So Maxime, we will get back to you on this and see if we can move your presentation to the plenary as well. Thanks all. This was a very good information. And as I mentioned in the chat, we will also be sharing the slides with everyone.
Thank you, Özlem.
Thank you, everybody, for coming back from the breakout sessions. I think we'll allow a few seconds for everybody to join in. Just on my particular session, we actually didn't manage to go through completely our presentations. So maybe I'll check also what the situation was in other breakouts, but I would like to give an opportunity to Jata Singh, who was interrupted session, to just briefly finalize her points. And if that's if that was also the case in other breakout groups where sort of a final contributor didn't have a chance to finalize their presentation, then I would also plan to do that. Before then, I think we would hear back from the rapporteurs. But with that, maybe Sasha, I saw you among the participants. We were in the same breakout group, but you had sort of didn't have a chance to finalize. So maybe if you could, in a nutshell, just share with the plenary some of the key points that you still wanted to make. And I mean, maybe in the interest of time, keep that quite focused, and then we can go to the rapporteurs or see if there were other contributions that were not finished during the breakout groups. Sasha,
sure, no problem. Thanks so much. So I am the Commonwealth National Climate Finance Advisor to Antigua and Barbuda. So I was speaking in the SIDS working group session to discuss, Antigua and Barbuda's approach to access to climate finance. So, I mean, what I briefly spoke about is that Antigua and Barbuda, we look at climate finance from it comes from a variety of sources, and our approach is multifaceted. And we seek to, develop a comprehensive package of projects and climate actions that ensures that we have a robust climate finance pipeline. We're also accredited to the Adaptation Fund as well as the Green Climate Fund. And we're going to be commencing the process of GCF reaccreditation and status upgrade soon. And also what we found is that technical assistance from various partners have really enabled Antigua and Barbuda to strengthen the necessary institutional frameworks and capacity for improving access to climate finance. So that's like through the Ndc Partnership CAP project, as well as the Commonwealth Climate Finance Access Hub, and also the GCF Readiness Program, which really helped to build this institutional and technical capacity for climate finance. So we're actually recently approved our 5th readiness project, which is a 3-year multi-year readiness that will build upon previous readiness outcomes. And we're going to develop priority concept notes that are directly aligned to our updated NDCs. I just want to shortly mention a few challenges and opportunities for SIDS and access into climate finance based on our experience. So Antigua and Barbuda recently graduated from the DAC list in January 2020, which limits our access to existing donor sources. And this is the case of many Caribbean SIDS who are no longer on the DAC list, but who remain most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. So what I think we want to reiterate is that development assistance is separate and apart from climate finance. And as such, criteria used to assess the eligibility for development assistance should not be used to assess eligibility for access to climate finance. And AOSIS and the Caribbean Development Bank and others are developing other tools such as the AOSIS Multidimensional Vulnerability Index, and the CDB is developing the Recovery Duration Adjuster, which might be a better measure of vulnerability to access climate finance for SIDS. Also, it should be noted that climate finance should support sustainable development core benefits, such as achieving the SDGs, while development assistance should incorporate specific financing to make development projects such as basic infrastructure such as roads and healthcare centers more climate resilient. And usually traditional development assistance doesn't provide this additional financing to ensure that that climate resilience is incorporated in these development projects, and SIDS need both, not just one or the other. And lastly, I just want to mention that Antigua and Barbuda is considering a debt for climate swap as an innovative financing mechanism, and it's included in our NDC targets. And through funding from the Open Society Foundations, we're currently undertaking a project on behalf of AOSIS to look at debt for climate considerations for SIDS. And some of the key findings coming out are the need to manage expectations for a debt for climate swap instrument from borrowers, creditors, and climate funders. So climate finance by donors usually provide technical assistance on climate action, while creditors are interested in debt repayments and not climate benefits. But debt for climate swap should be developed to solve the debt issue and the climate issue for SIDS. So we need to look at developing robust frameworks for ensuring that climate finance funders, borrowers, and creditors are on the same page for debt for climate swaps. So these are just some key challenges and opportunities to share in terms of what Antigua and Barbuda is doing so far. So thank you so much for allowing me the opportunity to complete my intervention. And I look forward to a discussion in the plenary. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sasha. And maybe with this, I would then invite rapporteur from the first breakout group to speak before we go to the third breakout group, where I think we have a summary and also a sort of quick condensed intervention. But please, who is going to come in from the first breakout group to report back?
So it's going to be me, Jens, and I think we've had a very similar situation where our colleague David was cut through in the middle of the presentation. So maybe at the end of what I say, maybe he could come back to wrap up what he was saying, because I think it was quite interesting. And so basically we had three presentations, 3.5, as I said, that were telling us about a number of different things about how to be effective in capacity development and what kind of needs to happen in order to achieve the transformation that we need to face climate change. The first presentation was telling us about the need to think more broadly on what capacity is and to ask ourselves key questions such as what is the vision for it, what kind of agenda who is the agenda setter, who is going to benefit from the capacity and so on. Then we had a presentation from the UK on the task force to access climate finance, and which is interestingly trialing a new approach to address blockages and ensure the funding is flowing to these countries inter alia through capacity development investments. And that is based on a number of principles, namely alignment, coordination, taking programmatic and inclusive approaches, and the plans to continue with these trials and present some results at COP27. Our IIED colleagues presented quite a large scale and comprehensive program to strengthen climate capabilities in institutions that looks at different types of entry points. It takes the entry point of the constituency of development institutions and organizations, aims at changing the rules of the games, and looks at skills of individuals, and that's so through formal and informal tools and ways of working. And finally, our colleague David, whom I would like to please ask him to come back again to present some of the insights from Central Asia and Eastern Europe, who's also implementing a capacity development program for countries in that region, and takes a programmatic approach and a subsector approach. And he was telling us about the programmatic approach, and maybe he can say a few concluding words on that. And apologies again for the management of this
program. Can you hear me? Okay, yes, thank you very much, Juan. I was about in the middle of the presentation. So basically, to wrap it up, our main objective when we apply this programmatic approach is basically to improve the image of public subsidies. That when the subsidies are applied on a large scale, for instance, like in the agriculture sector, it can be done also for other sectors on a much smaller scale. And we also want to make sure or make clear that there are also good subsidies besides, for instance, fossil fuel subsidies, that we can support, for instance, renewables with a little bit of public money, as I mentioned, to tip the scale of the decision making of the private sector towards more friendly, climate friendly, and environment friendly technologies. And we also make clear that to our partners and also to the citizens that applying the programmatic approach brings multiple benefits, not only for the environment, if the program is applied in one of the environmental sector, but it can bring broader benefits also to the citizens, like for instance, improving the states of environment or public services or access to jobs, etc. It also brings benefits to public finances through increased effectiveness and efficiency of public spending. And importantly, because it is a capacity development project, it brings benefits to public authorities through enhanced investment planning and management capacities. And it also increases because many times environmental programs and projects are cross-sector. It also increases the cooperation and communication between the ministries or in general public authorities on many levels. So this would be wrapping up my presentation in short. Thank you very much.
Thanks from my side. And with that, let's go over to breakout group 3 on the private sector. And there I think we also will have a summary which will be provided by Sebastian from Belgium, and then followed by a short intervention from Maxime from United Nations University, because there we had ran into the same challenges and all the other breakout groups. So starting with Sebastian, and then please over to Maxime from there.
Yes, thanks a lot for giving me the word. I'm going to briefly recap the 3 presentations we have had, and then I'm going to give the word to Maxime with pleasure. So in the first presentation, we heard about the barriers and challenge to access climate related finance, namely lack of knowledge and capacity on how to prepare investments, ready climate resilient practice, also high cost and risk associated with preparation and investment ready proposals, the lack of access to adaptation focused investors, and we could actually question how much adaptation focused investors exist right now, or if it's only a niche. And then the lack of capacity to monitor and evaluate impacts of the projects, So we learn about some solutions that have been developed by the Landscape Resilience Fund. It's an international fund which is co-managed by South Pole and WWF, and it's a winner of the Jeff Challenge. It's currently also mainly funded by it, if I understood correctly. One of the mechanisms of the instrument the Landscape Resilience Funds has available, it's a pre-investment support scheme, which is actually very interesting, with the purpose of resolving some of the shortcomings that I've mentioned before. And also it's not only, the idea is not only to get money channeled from the fund or to the SMEs, but to basically match SMEs also with other potential private investors. So the pre-investment support was mechanism was explained. It includes technical assistance and project development early on. And I think one point that the presenter insisted on was the importance of the governance in these kind of projects through multi-stakeholder platforms. So I think it comes back to the ownership and to how grounded in the context, the local context, actions needs to be. Then the second presentation was about a bureau which is helping to increase the competitiveness of Senegal companies. And in 2010, basically it began to be more involved in enhancing the company's profile in practice to increase their competitiveness on green standards also. So it was mentioned by the presenter that it was also actually thanks to the support of French AFD and the EU that happened, and also a support from GIZ and UNIDO. And it's interesting to see that it's now involved in sustainability aspects, waste, recycling, upcycling, energy efficiency in their programs. It has a pool of experts including agribusiness, energy efficiency, environment, monitoring and evaluation, financial feasibility, and it is positioned in different regions of Senegal. The third presentation was by the GIS colleague who presented very briefly because of time problems, time issue, should I say, presented the action regarding access to climate finance, and in particular related to the Green Climate Fund. So first, it gave a very quick overview of the financial flows that can be influenced by taxonomy, regulatory environment, climate risk management and disclosure, for which the project on partnering for readiness is working on. Then the objective of the project I just cited, partnering for readiness, was explained. And yeah, so basically one of the objectives was the highlight that deserves to be highlighted is acting as a sparring partner for the GCF, the Global Climate Fund. We heard also briefly about GIZ Sustainable Finance Policy Navigator, which is a tool that allows to give advice to guide partner countries on sustainable finance reforms. And so this was just before we came back to the plenary. And I would now like to give the word to Maxime to give the last presentation.
Many thanks, Maxime. Over to you, and just maybe to briefly say that we will also have a rapporteur in addition to the intervention that we heard from Sasha. We have a rapporteur for the second session coming after Maxime. So please, Maxime, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much for the invitation and also for the opportunity to present in plenary. I won't be long, and for the sake of its efficiency, I have reworked my presentation and made it a bit shorter. I would present you today. I wanted to present a case study, but then I think I will present the overall approach, which is the goal of it. Was actually to match the investment portfolio needs from KfW, a German development bank, with the needs of different stakeholders and beneficiaries in different countries. One of them was Honduras, but then we were also working in Ethiopia and Vietnam. So basically, it's all about how can we quantify adaptation to match these investment portfolio needs. So I'm working for UNU, and UNU, you can think of it as an institution that bridge between knowledge and action. And we are trying to bring this knowledge, these tools, such as the economics of climate adaptation that we'll present right now, to different institutions, UN institutions, but also multilateral and governmental development agencies, such as, for instance, colleagues from GIZ, or Frankfurt School, or Insurance Solution Fund. Basically, decision makers are facing three main questions. The first one is, what is the exposure to risk, population-wise, assets-wise? And the second one is, if I have an exposure to climate change, how can I reduce that? What kind of adaptation measures can I consider? Traditional ones, but also ecosystem-based adaptation, but also insurance risk transfer. And the third one comes very rapidly, is how to finance that. And if you want to finance that, then you have to think in terms of cost efficiency, which measures are the most efficient for the exposure and for the hazard we are exposed to. To do so, we are using and further developing with ETH together with Swiss Re, Munich Re, so the private sector. We are using one of their tools, which is called Climada, which is embedded in the economics of climate adaptation framework. Climada is a modeling platform. It's open source. It's free for all. We are giving it out for free with new developments, etc. It's all on GitHub. I can give you the links. And we are using this modeling platform in order to quantify adaptation and quantify all the three questions I was presenting before. We are pricing the different assets, from housing to ecosystems to roads networks, airports, etc. We are also quantifying hazards. We are quantifying floods, but also droughts, heat waves, and so on and so forth. So we have different modules to quantify them. We bring both of them together in a damage assessment, so we can look into today and also in the future for different scenarios, socioeconomic scenarios and climate scenarios. What is the expected damage for certain assets, for ecosystems, for populations, for a certain set of assets separately, or assets put together? And looking into that, we can discuss with decision makers, with stakeholders, using also capacity development, using this tool, which is open source, with different partners from academia, for instance, and look into what kind of measures can we actually apply, from ecosystem-based adaptation, infrastructure, community-based adaptation, such as early warning and risk transfer as insurance. And once we have done that, then we reach what we call the unlocking climate finance. So typically you have funding agencies such as KfW, but also ADB, we were engaged with them, that are financing the portfolio we are proposing to these countries. So there are different examples, so I'm not going into that for the matter of time, but you can find all studies in a lot of different countries, from Frankfurt School, from us, from ETH, on this website, ecanetwork-network.org. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Maxime, for this accelerated presentation. Definitely very interesting. I already request to share that. I would like to now also invite Ridhi from UNFCCC to provide a quick sum up of the discussion in breakout group 2. Ridhi, could you come in, please?
Yes, will do. Thanks, Jens. By the way, Maxime, we can still see your screen, so I think you have to stop.
Yeah, exactly. I'm trying to. Yeah, exactly. Looking for that. Thank you very much.
No worries. We pretend that we didn't look at any of your emails.
Very important emails. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yeah, just to quickly give you an introduction, my name is Ridhi, and I support the capacity building subdivision at the UN Climate Change Secretariat as the PCCB Network Coordinator. Very happy to be at this event. 2.5 hours. We're staying strong. There are 73 of us still on the call. So I guess I will quickly wrap up what happened in breakout group 2, which had a focus on SIDS. So we started off with a presentation, just so that I get the names right, by Kirsty, who is from the Pacific Strategy branch of the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. And what she did was sort of gave us an overview, a very good map of what the Pacific Island countries look like and how they're extremely vulnerable. And of course, given their vulnerability, also need a lot more access to finance, right? Because without access to finance, the cost of climate adaptation will be very, very challenging for these countries, right? And I mean, as of now, what these countries deal with is that they are preparing for new disasters to hit while they're recovering from the previous ones, right? So in terms of vulnerability, it's quite alarming. And she sort of laid out what Australia has been doing in terms of supporting SIDS in the way that they have increased their climate finance commitments, gave in a couple of numbers as well in terms of how the commitments for 2020 to 2025 is around $2 billion, and specifically $700 million going to Pacific Island countries. And then also how Australia supports climate resilient infrastructure and private sector led tech solutions. So that's what came out of the first speaker in terms of how Australia is supporting the SIDS. Then we had the presentation by Giovanni Henry, who is from the Commonwealth Secretariat. He gave us an overview of the Commonwealth Climate Finance Access Hub, and we heard from two of the finance advisors from there. Lavanya was in the plenary before, and then we also had Sasha, who completed her presentation towards the end of when we all came back to the main plenary, right? I think from his presentation, some of the key things was that this Access Hub is very country driven, and they also have focus on mainstreaming youth and topics of youth through stuff like green entrepreneurship, green jobs. And towards the end of his presentation, he also had a couple of, say, not recommendations, but things that donors can look forward to, one of them being how collaborations are key in terms of support to SIDS, and then how donors could increase their support towards initiatives and programs based in the SIDS, and then how donors should also sort of embrace new and innovative financial instruments. So that's what came out of the second presenter. And then we had Sylvia from Adaptation Fund. We started off that presentation with a video where we saw what Adaptation Fund support is towards SIDS. And a couple of things, just to mention them, Adaptation Fund also has special seats on the board for SIDS. And I think there were a couple of countries that she mentioned. And I guess, Sylvia, if you could drop them in the chat, because I could only capture some things while you were speaking. And then how 24 of their projects are, and 19 of them are within SIDS. So a lot of numbers, a lot of stats, and how there are 7 national implementing entities and 4 regional implementing entities that the Adaptation Fund supports. She also outlined the accreditation process and what some of the gaps that they found and how they mitigated these, or like mitigating factors for such gaps. So that was wonderful to hear, but also about the Adaptation Fund's knowledge products. And yeah, we will also be sharing all the resources, links, and everything that we can. I mean, the OECD, the PCCB Network, all web pages to all registered participants. So we'll send that over. And I guess we all heard from Sasha, but just towards the beginning, what she did say was for Antigua, the national development priorities and NDC targets are what define their access to finance priorities. And what they look at is complete packages of projects, programs, and plans which co-benefit sustainable development as well. And I guess she did a great job of like sort of wrapping up her presentation, but also letting the entire plenary know on what Antigua's perspective was. So I think I'll stop here. Back to you, Jens. Thanks.
Great, thanks so much, Rudy. So I guess we realized we had an extremely rich set of discussions, starting with the plenary, then in the breakout groups. And now we should really use the time for some further exchanges from everybody from the audience on any of the topics. So, if you have any questions, any suggestions, any comments that you would like to make, please raise your hand and we will call upon you. Great if somebody could break the ice. If there's a bit slow reaction from the floor, then I would be happy to come up with some questions, but I see we already have a hand raised by Alejandro. Please, Alejandro.
Thank you very much, Jens. Maybe just to break the ice, maybe just to share with your audience, because I was part of the private sector group and very interesting initiatives, and just wanted to mention that here at the Climate Change Secretariat, we recently did a series of mapping studies on what are the capacity building needs and gaps of small and medium-sized enterprises in various regions. We did one study in Southeast Asia, one in Southern and Eastern Africa, and one for the Middle East and Northern Africa. And we have shared the results of these studies in different events at the regional climate weeks and the capacity building hubs. So very interesting findings in terms of what are the gaps and needs that were already highlighted in your session, but we want to move forward out of from the these studies have a series of recommendations that we want to move forward with, and we're looking for collaboration with other partners and synergy with other initiatives. So I wanted to put that on the table. One important aspect of these studies is that we also looked at a mapping of academia and research organizations in terms of what they could offer as providers of capacity building to help address the needs and gaps of SMEs. So we have those two elements. We believe that engaging academia and research organizations on the country level could be a way of helping advance country ownership, but also retention. So I wanted to flag that. These studies will be published soon, and we're happy to share the links once they're available, but we have some presentations. The other aspect is also a bit of a promotion. The PCCB recently launched a toolkit on tools and methodologies for identifying and assessing capacity building needs and gaps to implement NDCs. We did a webinar some weeks ago, and we're just again an invitation for any of the organizations to contribute with their own tools and methodologies on assessing and identifying capacity building needs and gaps. That would be more than welcome, and I think really can maybe put a link there, because we have the toolkit as a document, but also a web page where we're populating it with all resources on this aspect. So to promote the exchange of lessons and experiences. Just wanted to say that. Hopefully that served to keep to break the ice. Thanks, Jens.
Great. Thanks a lot, Alejandro, for doing this and raising both, I mean, the issue of academia as an important dimension, also of capacity, but also then referring to the toolkits that certainly will be very interesting to see coming forward. Now, you also, I think, focused the discussion very much again on the core subject of capacity. I think from what we've heard sometimes, you know, from the capacity angle, obviously there was a specific focus on the dimension of capacity to access finance. Maybe Özlem, do you want to come in and ask a question or comments in that regard?
Sure, happy to. Can you hear me, Jens?
Yes, and also put on the video.
Oh, trying. Yeah, sorry, didn't realize that it was off. I would have two questions as well from the private sector session. One regarding to Paula Wolfs from GIZ. If you could maybe say a bit what you potentially are doing in the area of access to finance from the GCF. I think that would be helpful if you have any insights on that. And to Maxime. I think what would be good, just judging because you have a little bit of a different entry point, because as you mentioned, you're in between practice and research. What are from your work, from your angle, what are some of the concrete entry points and tools, I guess, that donors could use to effectively support the private sector? I think that would be helpful. And yeah, not wanting to put both of you on the spot, but maybe you can, there's a way for you to answer this. Thanks.
Many thanks, Özlem. So maybe before we go to ask them to answer the questions, we have a hand raised from Fatou Diana from Senegal. And we also have a question in the chat that I think also could be addressed. So, but please first, Fatou, comment on your question.
Merci beaucoup. Voilà, en fait, la question que j'avais, c'est par rapport aux activités que nous menons. Vous avez dû le voir, en fait, nous accompagnons beaucoup le secteur privé, mais nous passons quelquefois par des intermédiaires pour pouvoir lever certains financements. C'est le cas, par exemple, des financements qu'on a pu obtenir pour le projet Ville durable. Donc, cela a été par le biais de l'ONUDI pour pouvoir accéder à des fonds par rapport au fonds vert climat, au fonds pour l'environnement mondial, excusez-moi. Alors, ma question, c'était de voir, est-ce que nous, au niveau d'une structure comme le bureau de mise à niveau, est-ce qu'on pourrait pouvoir bénéficier de renforcement de capacité qui nous permettrait de pouvoir lever justement ces financements-là. Et quels seraient les mesures, les moyens en tout cas pour nous d'accéder à ces financements, puisque nous avons une demande qui est là, qui est forte. Avec le projet Ville durable, nous avons accompagné une dizaine d'entreprises, mais le potentiel est beaucoup plus important, notamment sur le volet donc des entreprises industrielles qui sont installées un peu partout et qui ont besoin d'être accompagnées pour pouvoir également mettre en place des projets de développement durable. Donc, merci, c'était ça la question.
Merci beaucoup Fatou pour cette question. Juste un petit suivi. Est-ce que vous aimeriez bien diriger cette question à un participant particulier ou on laisse répondre ceux qui veulent?
Oui, je pense que ceux qui sont habilités, en tout cas ceux qui pensent qu'ils peuvent nous appuyer, sont les bienvenus. Je ne vais pas cibler quelqu'un en particulier. Donc voilà. Okay. Mais en tout cas, c'est une question qui est ouverte. Merci.
D'accord. Merci beaucoup. So we had this question as an open question on, what are the next steps? There's strong demand, in this case, in the case of Senegal, for additional or complementary funding to what's already been provided. And I think that probably links quite well to the question that we saw in the chat about, the question of the sustainability of supporting capacities, but then making sure that they are actually continuing beyond the duration of the actual project that is being supported. Then we had two questions from Muslim directed towards GIZ and Maxime from United Nations University. So maybe as I would invite our GIZ colleagues and Maxime to respond, then also it would be great if others who could respond to the other question could also raise their hands so that we could call upon them to answer them. So maybe let's start with GIZ. I'm afraid I missed the name there, but I hope you identify yourself or you know who's meant. Okay, Pablo.
Yeah, thanks, Jens. Yeah, sure. Thanks, Özlem, for the question on access to finance, particularly from the GCF. So the GIZ is a delivery partner of the GCF readiness program that was mentioned before, inter alia by Nadesh from CTCN, who's also the delivery partner. And maybe firstly to highlight a challenge within access to finance and the GCF, which is the fact that there are quite a few national institutions already accredited to the GCF, but of those, only a few are actually implementing GCF projects. So there are these challenges of developing successful projects that get selected. One of the challenges is access to data, and obviously also the resources within the institutions to build a strong climate rationale. So what we find is an important element in addressing this challenge is the support between countries. And I think that had been mentioned also before in the panel, because there are a lot of national institutions, direct access entities that already have a good experience with successful projects for the GCF and can share their knowledge with others. Also with regards to accreditation, which can also be quite challenging and take several years. So one project we are currently supporting is the Community of Practice of Direct Access Entities, and also a CITS initiative where one of the main focus areas is to enable this exchange among the institutions on their challenges, but also on their lessons learned on how to develop successful projects. And yeah, I think that's an area also where the GCF itself put a lot of emphasis on to enable this knowledge sharing among those institutions which are either already accessing the GCF or in the process of accessing it. Yeah, I think that's it from my side on that question. Thanks.
Many thanks. You also have the opportunity, if you wanted to respond to Fatou's question, I think as one of the potential answers, but that's just an option, you know, otherwise.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, Fatou, I'm not sure if I understood your question entirely. I switched to the interpretation a bit late, but I understood that your question was mainly about and how far your project and I think particularly on the cities, the 3 cities you're supporting, if I understood that correctly, could potentially also access the GCF. And as GIZ is also involved in this project, I think the easiest way is we talk about that bilaterally, but for the benefit of all, yeah, the GCF readiness funds can be accessed by every country, and it's usually managed through the national designated authority or GCF focal point of each country. That's the institution who kind of decides where the resources can be spent for. So that would be the first institution to speak with and see if it could be an option to access readiness funds for your project.
Many thanks, Paula. Now let's move on to Maxime for the second part or the second question Özlem posed. Maxime, are you with us? Can you respond to that?
I am with you. Let's see if I can respond. I think the question, just to reformulate that, was what is the, coming from different angle, what is the relation to capacity development? And that's a very good question, because what we are looking at is how to make our climate action sustainable. When it comes to adaptation, then we are always looking at what is happening today and what is happening in the future. And to do that, looking at the future, it's you always have to, like reinsurers do, for instance, you have to re-evaluate the situation every year, because then, of course, then when you are moving on in time, then the situation might change. For instance, to give you an example, you can have more populations coming in. In order to do that in a very effective way, you have to use tools such as the one I was presenting, quantitative tools. The problem with these tools are they are very effective, but they are very data intensive, and you need a lot of skills to use them. And this is where, when we are doing these projects, we are always coupling these with stakeholder involvement and capacity development activities, in order to make sure that in the countries where we are active, in the communities, in the municipalities, in the regions where we are active, that the tool we are using, Climada and ICA, are also used later on by the beneficiaries and the stakeholders. So we are always looking for a partner in academia, because they are always the most susceptible to be the one having the set of the skill set, let's say, needed to use these tools. And then we are providing capacity development, capacity building, etc. We have a set of different courses that we are offering. And as I said before, the tool is open source. There are a wealth of publications, case studies to apply that. And of course, we are always supporting this together with ETH and also a set of institutions that we call the ICA network. In these institutions, you have the private sector, mostly from consulting firms, but also reinsurance companies, etc., that are interested in using this tool. So that's, and I was just finished with that, just to reflect on what partner colleague from GIZ said. So we are doing a lot of work with GIZ, for instance, in China, but also in Vietnam, in capacity development, using the economics of climate adaptation and Climada for stakeholders there. So that's somewhere where we are actually very active. But then, yes, I think I'm done.
That's good. Thanks, Maxime. Thanks for that answer. Just to also say, there was a further question in the chat about more interest on a working group on private sector. I'm not sure if Alejandro may want to respond to that, maybe now or a bit later in the wrap up, because I think it may have been directed to work by your your group in that area. But let me also come back again and see if anybody would like to respond again to the question Fatou had put out there. Any representatives of institutions that work directly in providing capacity support, providing financing or funding in that regard? The floor is open. If you would like to take the opportunity to respond to that. We've of course have a first reaction from Paula, who offered the direct contact, so that's great. But just to see if anybody else would like to come in on this. Roberta, and please take the floor.
Thank you very much. I don't know if you can.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. Okay. Thank you. Now I'm intervening here as Italian government representative more than the capacity, the Paris Committee on Capacity Building co-chair, and to mention the support provided on fellowships to build capacities of young people in, well, not only refer to access to finance, but we funded a program of fellowships and secondments from seeds and LDCs to officers to join the Secretariat and UN offices in New York to build their capacities on their institutional capacities. So maybe the step before the access to finance. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Roberta. And now we pass it back to the Commonwealth Secretariat. Giovanna Henry, please.
Yes, thanks, Jens. Just one point on the issue of sustainability, I think, and ensuring that these initiatives are sustainable. So one of the things from our existing Access Hub model is that we ensure with this long-term deployment of advisors. So it's not just come in and briefly and sort of depart. So it's sort of a long-term embedment. So it's between 1 to 3 years and oftentimes even longer as well. So there's actually the space to train persons within the various government departments, the various government ministries that will allow that sort of train the trainer approach, which we're working on. So within that long-term tenure, it allows to ensure that there is sufficient capacity across various sectors, which is critically important, so that beyond our tenure in country, that there is that sort of strong base. And of course, we would have mentioned our efforts in ensuring that knowledge products are developed, which can of course be shared. So that is one of the simple ways which we ensure that our capacity development efforts are sort of sustainable and can be transferred within across time. Yeah.
Great, thanks so much. And then we have 2 more hands, and I think with that probably we'll have to wrap up unless anybody would like to quickly raise their hand. I think as long as I would invite Marie Lear to come in, and I would still accept raised hands, and after that close the floor. But then let's start with Marie and Lear, followed by then Sylvia from the Adaptation Fund.
Thank you, Jens. Just briefly to respond to our colleague in Senegal, it would be more interesting to learn a little bit more about what they're doing. Initially, the LRF, the Landscape Resilience Fund, focuses on rural landscapes and in activities taking place in the landscape or land management approach. But it would be interesting to still hear from them. I think it's a very interesting platform that can connect also different stakeholders. So happy to also take the discussion bilaterally and explore a little bit more on that, but also to make the point that this is more focused initially on rural landscapes. And then maybe secondly, just briefly to respond also to the question posed by David in the chat about how we ensure that the interventions are sustainable. So the Landscape Resilience Fund, as mentioned before in the summary, it has these 2 main windows, one on the SME side and one on the landscape approach. So we ensure on the one side, we build the capacities of SMEs, and therefore they also have this impact with the communities and the farmers they work with. And these capacities are there installed in the landscape. But secondly, we also have this landscape approach. That means we have either a landscape partner or a landscape coordinator working in the local area. And that means that also there is a follow-up, like we are then embedded in the landscape. And this is, I guess, one of the values of having this landscape approach, that then we have a follow-up, we are in the landscape, and we can also monitor what the SME is doing, how are the communities doing, but that means stay in the local level. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much, Marie, for that perspective. Then to conclude this round, Sylvia, please.
Thank you. No, very interesting discussion, and I just want to say that we have presented at the last board meeting. We have presented our draft for the next medium-term strategy for the 2023-2027, and it was a very interesting and innovative consultation process that we have done to arrive to that draft. And I do want to say that one of what we hear about the private sector engagement was, in fact, is embedded in the strategy because of the partnership and the stakeholder engagement at the local level, but including, of course, the private sector. But so we are, we're very interested, but it's not only an interest; it's actually part of the development of the new strategy. So I think we will be. I've heard even a working group or something, and go back. But it's definitely an interest element that we have already been dealing with for a number of years now. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Sylvia. So with that, I think we've come to the conclusion of the plenary round, and we have just a few minutes left, and we don't want to take a lot of time, I guess, keeping you any further. We're very grateful that you stayed with us for the now close to 3 hours that we have allocated for this topic, but I also think it showed the interest and the many dimensions of this topic. Now, I just say a few words, I guess, before I would invite then Alejandro to come in again from his side, on the conclusion here. And I think the first point is to say that I don't really would pretend to have any conclusions. But first of all, I would like to thank all the speakers and the participants for your engagement and for your contributions. I think it's quite hard to draw out any key point from the richness of the discussions, but I think there are a couple of things that at least stuck in my head a bit in terms of thinking further around the issue of capacity on access to finance and what the relationship is. And I think one point is that there's, of course, capacity in terms of knowledge, in terms of awareness, but then there's capacity in terms of the ability and the availability of deploying resources and actually apply that knowledge. And I think they are invariably extremely complementary or codependent, but I think sometimes the discussion goes more into one than or in the other direction, and it's really essential to keep them together. Another point or another reflection that came to me in discussing this is to really reflect upon, as we talk about capacity to access finance, there are two questions: what finance and what capacity? And is it, when is it the capacity to access basically international public finance? When is it more the capacity to access, mobilize private finance and investments? And for me, I guess you could say that the bigger challenge maybe is to access finance for climate that can be used for climate action, or the more fundamental challenge is accessing finance for that can be used to take more climate action, but at the same time, the climate finance that provides the capacity or to do that specifically. I guess it's that may have to be formulated a bit more in a bit more sophisticated way that I'm able to do now. But I think fundamentally, if we look at what the constraints are, and I think that's the other point that I mentioned. What is the specificity of the capacity challenge? Does it relate more to general capacity constraints, as are just typical and characteristic of many developing countries? And we had even more pronounced for countries like SIDS, where we had a special discussion. or is it related to the specificity of the climate issue and how that could be addressed? And maybe just the last point in terms of the sustainability aspect that was mentioned. What came out really, I think, is the, in a way, the fundamental principle of development effectiveness, that you need ownership as a practical necessity. Ownership in terms of embedding activities at the local level and having them owned there, not so much as a sort of a quasi-legal principle, but just the reality that if something is to be sustained, it has to be owned at the local level. So these are just a couple of very high-level takeaways, and some of the takeaways are still questions from my side. We'll certainly keep working and engaging on this, and we'll have more webinars, as I said. But with that, I would like to thank you again and pass over for final comments to Alejandro. Thanks again from my side.
Thank you very much, Jens. I will be brief because, I mean, you already mentioned some of the key highlights. I would just add that something that I caught my attention a lot is the scaling up, the moving from projects or pilot projects to more programming. So I think that's also a very important point. So yeah, again, thank you very much. I think this first workshop inaugurates the very fruitful collaboration between the OECD and the PCCB network. And on behalf of the PCCB and the Climate Change Secretariat, really would like to thank the OECD for taking a lead in this series, and to the Commonwealth Secretariat for their contributions to this event. I think we all saw that through the panel discussion and breakout groups, we have mobilized important stakeholders working on supporting capacity development in developing countries. And I would like to take this opportunity to thank all of them, and also our wonderful audience, because I mean, we're after 3 hours and we still have a lot of people here. So thank you very much for that. From the many institutions that participated today, either as panelists or leading breakout groups and participants, it is evident that the capacity building, capacity development community or stakeholders is made of diverse institutions, players, and all of them have their own role in enhancing climate-related capacities to deliver timely climate action and raise climate ambition. That being said, and this is from the perspective of the PCCB as a constituted body under the Convention and Service the Paris Agreement, has the mission to enhance the coherence and coordination of capacity building efforts related to climate change. And in this sense, the PCCB has established the PCCB Network in April 2020 to support this mission, this aspect of coherence and coordination. Therefore, through the link in the chat, please do sign up and join the PCCB network to connect with peers across sectors and regions. To stay updated with events like this, please also join us on LinkedIn, and we will be providing the link shortly. So again, just to conclude, your contribution and participation in these events are very much appreciated, and we would like to be grateful for your feedback as well, as I mentioned in the beginning, and just if you can fill out the questionnaire. And again, this is the first of a series that promises to be very, very interesting. And please keep tuned, stay tuned, and thank you again to the OECD and all our partners. Thank you, and wish you a nice afternoon, evening, wherever you are. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.